right. Well, Kyle, I want to thank you for coming on and as a former racer, and you've only been out of it what about we're 26, so about 6 years now.
Yeah, it's
Let's
been about
go.
6 years.
Let's take a step back and start from the beginning kind of. I was one of the traditional ones that started in karts. I was fortunate enough to have Roebling Road right in my backyard, so I spent a lot of my karting days there, and then going to Florida, for kart week, and up to Atlanta and doing like AMP and stuff. So I've had the usual karting background. But for you, you were saying that you didn't have the usual karting background. You want to kind
Yeah,
of give us some insight into that?
yeah. I guess my path wasn't very traditional. I never had any karting experience. I was one of those kids in high school playing basketball, baseball, golf, and I always had a love for motorsports. And Need for Speed was honestly one of my favorite games as a kid growing up. But I never had that entry into karting, so I never developed the talent or the skill. Uh, we live on a lake, so I was racing jet skis around against my brother at one point, and my dad and my family noticed that I wasn't too passionate about the other sports as much as I was about anything that had an engine in it. And so I went the path of at 16 when I got my driver's license. My dad enabled me to go to Skip Barber Racing School, and everyone in motorsports is pretty familiar with Skip Barber.
Yeah.
It's one of the best breeding grounds for training, even out of karts. Um, I picked it up pretty quickly, but it was a really hard entry and transition. Um, Fortunately, I started so fresh, and I think looking back, that was a big advantage because had I had experience driving a street car for a long period of time, I probably would have really struggled getting into even a Skip Barber car. But because I had no driving knowledge and no bad habits from the street, I was able to really learn fresh and learn the right techniques early. Um, Skip Barber's application allowed me to do 3 series. So I did the winter, summer. I believe I did summer, winter, and then I won the third summer. And that for me was what really helped the transition into real motorsports. Because they had the $200,000 scholarship at the time. So that
Okay.
$200,000 was a huge deal for me. That transitioned me out of Skip Barber into the Mazda Prototype Light series. And we got very fortunate to be trying to test some radicals at one point in time
Okay.
because there's the Radical
Cup.
SR3 series and Radical
Yeah.
R. And we met Brent with Performance Tech over at Sebring when we were testing a Radical one day. And simultaneously, I had that scholarship into Mazda Prototype Lights. So it was like a perfect colliding of the right team, the right series, the right scholarship. And so I ended up trying to like work my way up that Mazda Lights ladder. Um, and it was a perfect little path that I think if I were to do it all over again, I would probably do the same thing. Um, but I was also lucky that I didn't have a lot of experience because I was able to develop quickly through that. Um, I know a lot of the carters from my perspective start Skip Barber with a little bit more experience, but they have to transition out of learning what a cart drives like. So
Yeah.
how was that for you?
That
Because
was
I couldn't imagine what it was like having 5+ years of driving something that doesn't even have like a
so when
suspension.
I started, I was 8, and I did it till I was 18. And so
Yeah,
coming, I'm 22 now, and so when I that's only been 5 years, and the money going into karting now is just through the roof.
ridiculous. Yeah,
Um,
it's
I've
ridiculous.
I was talking with some drivers this week, and they were saying, the money you could spend, racing in a national series like SCUSA or something, you could go put that into one of the, feeder IMSA series and race a full year. And
Yeah,
so
it's crazy.
coming out of karts, I did a few little spec Miata testing because that's what I kind of wanted to do was
Mhm.
when I was coming out of karts, MX5 was really, growing into this what it is now that you see it. And so that's what I kind of wanted to do was getting something like that. And so I did a few tests. Did at Roebling Road was a lot of where I did a lot of my testing. Went up to Road Atlanta a little bit, but coming out of it, when you come out of karting, it really you learn racecraft, but when you're coming out of karts into something like a full blown race car, it's a whole night and day difference. So
Doesn't the car feel so heavy?
it felt so
Yeah,
heavy as a cart,
so heavy, so delayed.
y-
It doesn't do what you want it to do. It's
yeah.
yeah, cars are. cars are just such a different beast. And I would have been a terrible karter looking back because I don't think I would have had the ability to like adapt to one, how quick paced it was versus cars. So LMP2, have you ever driven any downforce cars?
No, Spec Miata was about as high as I got, and then I kind of
Like Miata?
stepped back and
That's fine. Yeah, yeah. So, um, race, that's the one thing that I really am frustrated with on racing in America for the most part. Just the opportunity for exceptionally talented individuals to have the access to funding in motorsports. It's really hard. I even
yeah,
struggle with that. I wanted to kind of work my way over to Indy Lights, but looking at Indy Lights budgets of about like 1 million plus for like the bottom series teams,
yeah,
and if you try and commit yourself to that, you're committing yourself to 1 million plus in sponsorship raised, but it's still not enough to cover the highest level engineering program. And once you get into downforce cars, you realize that 90% of the capability in a car is going to be how well engineered it is. Because when you're all within that last like half a second and you're fighting for that last like 5/10, in my opinion, granted, everyone has a different perspective. And there
yeah.
are exceptionally gifted, like Drupado Award,
Mhm.
he'll hop in any of those Indy Lights cars and be in the top three. Um, but like when you're up in that top half a second, the car makes the difference for the rest of most of us. And also if it's not set up to a perspective that you like to drive and your driving style. And that's kind of what I look at like the F1 guys. Um, it's just something that I feel like a lot of America is lacking, whereas Europe has more budget.
Yeah,
Europe has a lot more budget. So like the GP2 teams do a lot better with their engineering programs. It's just a different environment. And so that was one of the reasons for me exiting motorsports. But I'm really happy to see it's had a big resurgence. And I want to go back. But I exited during COVID when it was starting to die down in followership, viewership. I had other things that I wanted to work on. And looking back, I think I got out at the right time, but I can't wait to go back.
yeah.
So
I think,
honestly,
you
so
just, being out of it and just looking at it on TV, just from the, regular viewership, like the average person. And IMSA, you look at IMSA, the top series here in North America, it's just blustering. I mean, I can remember going to Daytona, and it was, the crowds weren't this big, but now you look at on the race, or even on Instagram or something, it's every race they're posting, there's more people than ever. And
that's
more
amazing.
I
So
think
it's
more
really grown in the last 2, 3 years, a
and
lot then.
I think a lot of
That's
that
awesome.
has to go with you remember racing against DPI and GTLM.
Yeah, absolutely. You think that
DPI,
really brought a resurgence into motorsports in America?
I think getting away from GTLM and going to GT3, because
You think
those
that's it?
cars are more like what you can go to a dealership and buy, I mean, look what every manufacturer is wanting to get into GT3. You can go buy that Mustang or Corvette, whatever you like, there's something you can pull for there. And so I think that was the
Yeah,
best thing that sports car racing did as a whole, is got away from that. Because if you read,
respect.
when I remember reading about like racer and stuff, GTLM was just costing teams so much. That's why Ford, Porsche and all of them pulled out right at, what was it, 22 was the last, 21 or
Yeah,
22 was the last year of
it
it.
was Cullen Braun and Core Autosport in the LMP2, and then I believe it was Porsche was their factory GTLM
Mhm.
program. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was by far the team to beat in LMP2 back when I was racing. And they had such a good program. They were such good drivers, such a strong team. Performance Tech and I, we fought against them as hard as we could.
And it
Yeah.
was,
No,
even,
I loved what we were able to put together as a team and an effort. But like looking at programs with manufacturing behind them was really, really hard as an LMP2 pro-am kind of situation.
you look at it now, more and more, I think more and more people are wanting to get into LMP2 because you know,
It's
it's a,
spec.
yeah,
Yeah.
spec, and it's a lot easier to get into an LMP2 than it is to try and go for hypercar and GTP, because without the budget or a factory contract, you're not going to touch it. I think what they're doing,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with what they're doing in Asia. Well, yeah, with the Asian Le Mans, they're going to have a pro-am privateer hypercar class.
That's
But
pretty cool.
but they're not. So it's don't work out because I think they're not going to want factory drivers, you know. But
Mhm.
the bad thing about it is, when they went to this convergence with it, they said we're going to have more and more privateer teams. There's no privateers except Porsche and Ferrari. Porsche
Right.
here in the U.S. has JDC and uh Proton, and then in Europe, Porsche has Proton and Ferrari has AF Corsa. So it's it hurts
They have
because
some pretty big programs over there.
yeah,
And then Montai in Germany for Porsche.
Porsche.
Is Montai still pretty big these days?
Yeah,
I
man,
haven't. Montai's still big.
they've committed full Michelin Endurance Cup this year in IMSA, and they won Sebring
Really?
with the pro car, the Grello, and then at Watkins Glen with the Pro Am car. It's funded by Ryan Hardwick.
I have to support like Montai just as like an authentic Porsche lover and Porsche being one of my favorite brands.
Yeah, I love
Right.
the
I,
Porsches.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love the Porsches. Especially them being like a German-based racing team. They're so committed. So I kind of like that aspect of it. Um, you know, I don't know what my timeline is on whether I go and do some coaching or anything like that, but man, I need to get back to the track. So
have you been recently, just to go watch or anything?
I haven't. I've been too busy with work, but
Yeah.
for the right reasons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. And I don't get to go to as many as I want to just because, college and then I'm doing my getting ready to do my medical
Nice.
internships and stuff.
Oh, very, very cool. Where are
Yeah.
you going to college?
I'm going to South University here in Georgia.
Okay.
And so
Very
I
nice.
want to I want to be I'm in surgical tech school, but I'm wanting to eventually get to be a PA.
Very nice.
And
Very, very
so
cool.
because
So are you familiar with what my dad's doing?
yeah, I remember I'm familiar with your dad because I remember you guys in IMSA, and so I've always thought that was really cool that, your
The
dad was a
father
doctor.
son duo. Yeah.
Yeah, I always thought that was cool that, that on the, IMSA was, or racing was just kind of a side, hobby for him. And, he's done all kinds of stuff. I started looking, he's, climbed some of the tallest
He's
mountains.
yeah, he's got a crazy background. My dad's ex Navy Special Forces.
Oh, I
He's
didn't know that.
does climbing for fun, and he's big into skiing and scuba diving. Racing for him was, obviously it was my passion, right?
Yeah.
Uh, for him, it was more of it's another challenge and a check in the journey of things that you can accomplish in a lifetime. And so I think that's how he looked at it. He looked at it as another step in learning lessons. And he took the philosophy of motorsports. So something that you and I embody as drivers, he took that philosophy that he's lived in honestly everything else he's done in life too. But he applied the data aspect and a pit crew into what he's doing at his OR with surgery. And so he tried to build a software platform and went out and built that. He tailored it specifically towards scrub techs so that scrub techs could gather more data and information like a timing and scoring. So we essentially built timing and scoring for surgery and then allowed it to organize rooms more efficiently so that the scrub techs can see all the tools and stuff like that through a visual platform. And racing was his big like inspiration for why he wanted to push it in because he wanted to just try and find ways to make the OR flow a little bit more efficient and smoothly, make it easier for scrub techs to come in and do their job with less stress. And we're military, so we understand from the perspective of like if it's not perfect in our family, it's not enough for the level of care and attention to detail that you want for a patient on the table. And so the motorsports pit stop, the data gathering, allowing to go back and analyze each case on a step-by-step basis is a good way for surgeons to not only teach each other, but for surgical techs to learn how to work with doctors they've never been with before so that even on the worst case, you're still 5 to 10 minutes faster than the average without it. So we're really trying to speed up cases without making people rush. Uh, so that's our little inspiration out of motorsports into tech, and so that's honestly why I've committed so much love and passion towards this goal. Um, it's the right mission, and you're going into scrub tech school, so
Yeah.
I think it'd be really cool if at some point, like, I can get this to a point where it's actually like grown quite a bit or standard and it's making a difference because that's kind of what I really want to do over the next like 5 to 10 years. I want to make a difference And then knowing how motorsports is, I want to go back after I've made the difference and kind of be a gentleman. I'd love to be a gentleman driver, but I don't know if I have it in me anymore to be pro.
It's
So
impressive, what your dad was able to do from, learning, someone that went into it kind of, blind. Y'all went into it, just based off what you were able to do at Skip Barber. And then, I watched some of those. I think it was like a 5-10 minute video about what he was doing his first year at Sebring and on YouTube. And it was just like, wow. But now hearing what he's been able to do, what he's learned from, because when you think about it, racing and being an OR do have a lot of similarities. I learned, everything is, it's precise. You've got to do it, at the right moment. And that was something
absolutely.
I thought.
Yeah,
And now hearing, firsthand what you've been able to see him do, that's really incredible what he's done.
absolutely. I've learned to think of each surgery as its own lab. Yeah. Every track's different. Every case is different. Every patient's different. But there are very, very specific similarities in each one. And so for us being able to digitize it, it's at least made it for inexperienced medical people like me, because I don't have the background in medical. And our product allows me to actually work inside the room alongside them and understand what's going on and be ahead of the case too. So, um, but yeah, so I'd love to get back to motorsports. My perspective, I don't know if I'm going to be seeing myself there in the next like year or two, but I hope so.
You know, we'll take a step back and I remember 2017, looking was a big year for your career. In
27 year.
prototype challenge, you swept the year pretty much except for you got a podium. I think it was you were off the podium at CTMP and then had another one. I think it was at Watkins Glen where it was like a third place. And then
Mm-hmm.
you were, joined Pato, James French, Nick Buell, three guys that have, really made a big career in racing, and y'all won that year. Pato and James, won every race but Petit. But you were fortunate enough, to have three of the biggest wins in motorsport there, to Rolex, Sebring, and Watkins.
Yeah.
How big was that year for you, just as a boost in momentum to keep going that next level?
Looking back, that year was the most successful year, I believe, in racing that I had in 17. I think there were seasons that I've had better years. Uh, yeah, I think there were seasons that I've had better years driver wise with a lot less success. So that's from my perspective, I guess, the conundrum. I performed in 2019, I'd say, in the LMP2 car as tip of the spear as I could say you'd get. The 2017 season, we were so well engineered. We had the right drivers, the right teams. We dominated the field, and it wasn't like the few cars that were in the field in 2017 were not competitive. There were some strong groups of drivers in 2017. We were just that extra step ahead, and James and Brent, I got to give props to them. They brought in an engineering program in 2017 for James's final season in the PC car. And Ross Bonnell, he's over at Dale Coyne, I believe, right now, up in IndyCar. Ross started our season off at Daytona, and he brought some IndyCar tricks from the ovals
Really?
for us in LMPC. Yeah, and so if you look at how we did at Daytona, me and Pato and James were all like tip of the spear on driver times, but we were also about a mile and a half faster on the straight than most of the other cars,
Wow.
while still gaining grip and speed in the infield. And there were some IndyCar tricks that went into that, and I'm happy to share them because honestly, it was just a little bit of brilliance with how he managed the ride heights. And for those aero cars, every millimeter away from the ground or getting that back wing out of the air is extra drag that's being completely reduced. And so we were able to pick up an extra 2 miles an hour, which was the difference between us dominating Daytona and then having a solid rest of the season with a properly engineered program. And what happened when we transitioned into P2 and not necessarily having something fully custom and tailored beyond uh, the basic Orca setup. Because we went into P2 and we were pulling from Orca's OEM catalog. It wasn't a fully custom engineered for each track. Uh, so that was kind of the difference between our P2 program and our PC program. And so I can look at myself as a driver and say, damn, by 2019, I think there were very few drivers that would have hopped in our car and been able to compete with me in that. But in 2017, we took every win, we swept everything, and it looked like the best year I've ever driven in my life. So there's that little bit of like a subtlety. And that's the thing about motorsports. You can never really tell unless you're the one in the seat.
Yeah. You remember looking back at 2019, the P2 class, it was on a hurting, obviously Europe, it was still, I wouldn't say it was great, but it was a lot
It was
better than it
very, very
was.
small. Yeah, we
Yeah.
only had two. We only had like two cars,
Yeah. At
two or three
Daytona,
cars.
Daytona,
Yeah.
we get the most. I think we had what, 5 or 6 at one point, and then the rest of the year it was, you just had to show up and you were guaranteed at least second or third place.
Yeah, you're right.
Um,
It was like more like 5 or 7 cars or something at Daytona. I believe Alonso was in that year.
yeah, Alonso did it in
Alonso was in it.
19.
It was really cool to do 2019 with my
Yeah.
dad because we ended up getting that second place, and for him that was such an incredible journey, and to beat Alonso, well, almost beat
Beat
Alonso.
Alonso. The year you
Yeah,
won it was the year that Jeff Gordon won it, and I remember that was a pretty crazy race because during the night it poured down rain, and in the early morning it was a
yeah, that was painful actually. I was in from 3 a.m. to 6:30, so I had a 3.5 hour stint during that like big double yellow. And you're so right. It was like 32 degrees, pouring rain. The wind chill on the back straight had to have been like negative 10, -20. And the wind's just blowing in all this water. I had a pool of water up to my waist of
wow.
just frozen ice. The radio had gone. So I'm sitting in the car. I'm going down the front straight doing this, like scuba diving.
Yeah.
I'm like patting my head as if I'm a scuba diver going down the front straight to try and tell them I'm about to crash the car. I'm like, I'm actually trying to like figure out how to communicate to the team. And my mom was in pits and she figured it out. She saw me patting my head and knew that that's how my dad used to, when we would wakeboard or scuba dive, communicate that we were done. I went around at around like 5:30, I believe. I saw the pit crew was out that next lap after I did that for my mom. And I peeled in, got out of the car, collapsed over the wall. I had hypothermia. It was brutal because the PCs were open cockpit, right?
Yeah, they
So
were open cockpit one.
all the DPIs, all the GT cars, it would have been so much more comfortable. But yeah, I was sitting in a bucket of ice for 3 hours.
Did you feel, going between the two that obviously you had your upsides and downsides to them. I feel like, in the open cockpit cars, you had a much better range of visibility that you could see a lot more stuff happening and kind of anticipate it compared to the closed cockpit where you're a lot more confined and while you still
That's a
have a
good,
big visibility though, but I think in the open cockpit cars, I liked that aspect. You could really see what was going on a lot better in front of you.
absolutely. I think perspective between the two is probably a big limiter on most drivers. If you really kind of like hone yourself in, you become a little bit more afraid of letting the car be free and forcing it and trying to take advantage of it. You really have to muscle the LMP2 car if you want to be quick. If you're afraid because of, like you said, the fact that the car is blocking your vision into the corner of really throwing it in, whereas the PC, you can see everything. So you're not afraid of just like throwing it in there and wheeling it out. It was a heavier car, but you're not limited by your perception of what you think is possible. You're more so like free to do what as a driver. It's kind of like a simulator. When you sit on a simulator, and I don't like as a driver the motion sims because I feel like it adds fake G-force. But when
Yeah,
you're sitting
I'm
on
not
it,
crazy about that either.
yeah, I think it kind of messed me up in the car when I was doing sim racing, especially with motion. Driving iRacing on sim with a really good pedal system and a steering wheel and just 3 monitors all the way around, I think is the best training. As you up those simulators, I think it actually gets worse for training as a driver because you're not training the technical capabilities of steering to pedal input.
Right.
you're training your physical senses on something that you don't actually experience in the car as you add the fake motion, as you try and build these multi-million dollar complex simulators that simulate yaw and roll. Like none of that happens in a real car. No
Right.
one's having a car rotate. So I don't know. That's my difference in perspective on like sim to real car. I think the basic sims 100% are where every driver should be training. And that's because when you try and go through those initial Skip Barber schools, they teach you about slip angle. They teach you about the tire ratio on how much throttle input you can have to steering degrees. And those are the things on a sim that you can calibrate and what your brain wants to actually do in a car to like an ideal. And you can follow the plus minus marker as like I would always love to follow the plus minus marker to try and gauge how my technique is through a corner and how I could trail brake a little bit less and roll more speed in. So I think being in a real car with the cockpit over you, I kind of got off topic. That's a little bit of craziness, but being in a real car with the cockpit over you, back to what I was trying to get to, is one of those things where it takes you into a perspective of limiting what you think is possible versus sim, you do it to how you technically feel it. Open cockpit, because you're free, you don't feel restricted by your environment. You don't feel claustrophobic. You feel a little bit more flexible to drive as if you're on a sim in like an open environment. And I think that's kind of the bizarre comparison that I was trying to get to.
Because
But
I'm we'll use Daytona for example with the open cockpit cars. It was more easier. I saw people, looking back
yeah,
because I remember those cars really well. That was when I started really following IMSA and stuff. Was that people were really wanting to make more, make the passes that you don't see people making now. They're a lot more timid to kind of. You look at the deep or the GTPs now. They're a lot more timid to try and make some of these passes because a lot of them are so restricted on division that, I mean, nowadays, if you look in some of the in car, they've got kind of like a rear facing camera, and there's mirrors, but when you still got the B post right there blocking, it still takes away some of that. You don't want to really throw it in there like you would compared to like when you raced.
mhm, absolutely, 100%. How's out of my curiosity, how's the feeder series these days? Are they strong? Like,
They're
are there
getting
good development paths?
if so if you're wanting, I think Ford right now has the best development path. You can start on. They've got a great way. So, I'm good friends with a lot of people in the Ford development ladder, and so they started in 2024. They started what they call Mustang Challenge, and so it was the new dark
Oh,
horse.
that's cool.
So it was 45-minute sprint rate, 2 races a weekend, 45-minute races, and so they've moved to a step below. They've got Mustang Cup, which is the same cars, but it's just, getting ready for you to, make that jump to IMSA. And so many of these guys that are coming out of Mustang Challenge are now going to GT4. I'm good friends with Sam Paley, who's been the big kind of star of what GT4, or embodied what going from Mustang Challenge to GT4 is. He's racing overseas in SRO and Europe and Australia, but it's cool to see what Ford is able to do because it gives you that clear path to go from
Right.
GT or GT4 to GT3, and now Lamar, they announced their hypercar lineup, so it's giving these guys a clear path to, this is something I can shoot for.
Absolutely, which is it's so nice to have targets and goals and to actually be able to work up a ladder with progression. And honestly, those new Mustang dark horses are so cool.
They are. I love them.
They really Ford's doing an amazing job with their lineup. I
Sebring,
love it.
those cars at Sebring are, really that's a great track for those cars because
Yeah,
a lot of those guys it's got, they got the Legends class and then the regular, mostly pro guys, and so Sebring's a great test to start the season off with it because, so many of them, go to Sebring for testing, and if you can survive Sebring, you can survive anywhere because that's the
100%.
toughest track
So
I've ever been on.
respect the bumps.
Yeah. You
Respect the
know,
bump. What's your favorite corner at Sebring?
I love going into 17.
17.
17, that was
Isn't
always
this
my favorite.
see? Isn't it sketchy?
Yeah, it was so scary because the car bounces and you don't know sometimes if it's gonna step out. And I've seen so many of them go, drivers left into that wall right there on exit, and
Uh,
right under the bridge too is that's where I always was like, always just
it's
holding
a
on.
sketchy corner. Yeah.
Um,
I always found one to be my favorite corner, 17 to be the hardest to maximize lap time. I
yeah,
was a little I was a little tentative on entry rolling in. I was really quick out of the corner, but it's so hard to be in those corners that have long, sustaining G
yeah,
forces. And like you said, 17 is one of those difficult ones just because on the entry for me was where I threw away all the time. I was afraid of really throwing it in there and I would overbrake instead of roll the speed deep into the corner and kind of slow down more at the apex past that entry wall, which was so hard. And I almost crashed there. I almost had a horrible crash in the rain. In the LMP2 car the year that we ran it, that first 2 hours of the 2019, I believe, Sebring race was pouring rain.
I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was really happy with that one. I really enjoyed that. I went because we only had a two-car field in
Two-
LMP2, right?
yeah,
So
that
for
was two
me,
cars.
it gave me the actual ability to compete against the DPIs. And so I went from the P2, I worked my way up to third in DPI that year in the rain at Sebring in those first 2 hours. And it was really, really my favorite part of the season because for so many reasons, the P2 car we couldn't grasp.
Especially
But
in the wet weather that y'all's car, I think, really had an advantage to the DPIs in a lot of ways.
yeah, I was right next to Alexander Rossi heading into 17. And I went on the inside of them. He tried to stick it. They were the Acura, right? So it
Yeah,
was
they
all
did have
chassis.
Acura.
Yeah, they had the Acura, which was the Orica chassis. I believe the Orica chassis was way superior to the Cadillac. It looked like the Cadillacs had a lot of grip on powering down on the
Yeah.
corners, but they understeered. Whereas the Orica was able to get the car to rotate still in the rain, and it was just a lighter chassis. But Caddy always seemed to put the power down. So no matter where they went, I think it came down to that. And we ran really soft springs at
Okay.
Sebring. So for us, it was good. We
Yeah.
really enjoyed the rain that year in LMP2. I personally think the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, I was in a street car. It wasn't a race car. I was in a GT3 doing a Chin Motorsports track day.
Okay.
I was going down the back straight. It was wet. As soon as I hit the brakes, ABS started going off. The
Oh
rear
wow.
ABS started tail fishing the car, and I wasn't even close to the corner. I was about to spin and hit that inside wall, and I wasn't afraid for like my safety or anything. It would have
Yeah.
been a slow, fine crash. I was just terrified of the fact that it happened. I was like caught off guard completely because it was all ABS warranted, and I looped it down into 17 with maybe like 6 or 7 spins. It was the
Wow.
craziest. But it's a prime example of why 17 is treacherous in the wet.
That's
Yeah,
the
there's all those asphalt patches too. Yeah, so I don't blame you.
that's the hardest. One of my few tests I did in the wet was Sebring, and that was the hardest. I think that was the hardest track to do in the wet, just because of so many of the track is so rough, rough and bumpy, and then in the wet, I think that adds another aspect of why that track, even in the dry, that's probably one of the most difficult tracks you can go to,
Yeah,
just because of
absolutely.
you know it's just the character of the track. It's not a you go to Daytona or something where well Daytona has some character with the bumps though, but I've never been to a track on the level of Sebring of bump. You know, during
Sorry.
your during sorry. We were kind of talking about just a second ago, when you were in P2, those cars were on par with the DPI. And I remember a few times JDC won, they had the P2 and won overall with it. You know, how big was that, for you to be able to realize, going in, there is a possibility we could, at worst be maybe overall podium or even take victory in it because, you look at P2 cars now and they've got nothing on these new GTP cars. I think those things are at least 15 to
Yeah,
20 mile an hour faster.
that's a crazy difference. Has the P2 been BOP'd?
I think yeah, they're going into a new BOP with the new car in 2030.
Okay. So they've really slowed the P2s down, or are they kind of
Yeah,
like around the same echelon that they were at 4 years, 5 years ago? Because I'm looking at lap times and it seems they're about 2 seconds off.
they're about 2 seconds off. It when in 21 when they moved P3 up to WeatherTech, the P3s were almost on par with the P2s at some of the tracks, and
That's
that
bad.
was yeah, that
That's
really
bad.
because they ran P3 and WeatherTech for 21, 22, and 23, and then when they brought GTP, they pulled them out because it was gonna be kind of like a moving roadblock in a way. Nothing against the P3 cars. I think they're a great car and a great stepping stone into if that's what you want to do prototype. But then with the hypercars on track, it was just not gonna work.
No, there's so much. There shouldn't be. The P3 is so much heavier and slower down the straights.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah, it's just roadblocks.
yeah,
But the fact that the P3s were competitive against P2s at some tracks, they really had to have messed up that VOP.
yeah.
So
I
that's not
remember
ideal.
watching Daytona and Road Atlanta, especially at Road Atlanta, the GT cars were passing, the P3 cars, and then they're right.
Yeah.
Some of those spots at track, a GT car is just as fast as the P2 car, just the way the downforce is, and so
Hmm.
it really made it interesting. And so that's when IMSA really kind of had to step in and make some changes there. But I
Yeah.
have no disrespect to the P3 guys. I think that's a great car and it's a great way to get into prototype racing. I think
Oh, 100%.
what
P3 is a really good development ladder. I think it's just a little expensive for what it's positioned as.
yeah,
Budget to development capabilities. P3 is not, at the top of motorsports, like in terms of budget wise. Obviously, Indy Lights is a significant jump
yeah,
versus a free program. You could run a full endurance series for an Indy Lights program, but I think P3 at maybe a 50% cost would be ideal. And that's where motorsports, I think, should be. Entry these days is too much.
oh, I agree. It costs
Yeah.
you out. You really,
There's a lot of talent out there in the world, and not enough people are having the opportunity to get into motorsports and showcase it. And I really feel like, at some point in my life, if I get to the point of being able to go create my own success story and have
yeah,
an automotive brand of some sorts pie in the sky, I would love to create an automotive brand with a racing pedigree and develop my own ladder series where the cars are actually engineered to be cost effective for the performance. It's easy to make a carbon chassis.
yeah,
Everyone's making carbon chassis these days. McLaren manufactures them for pennies on the dollar to what these prototypes are going for. It's really just a difference of like scale, where they're putting the money, and it's not hard to make a light car.
no, it's not.
It's
It's
not. Like I don't. Yeah, like you and me are on the same page. Like there should
yeah,
be more opportunity with a competitive ladder. Like so at some point I'd love to see if I could get out of what we're doing with some sort of a big success story. But up until then,
yeah. So when seeing a lot of those guys heading over into Europe, um. the budget, you see so many of them are able to go buy these like F4 cars and they're, basically the same in terms and they can just go keep making laps after laps at, a track that they're gonna go to the following week. And so, looking at the budget restraints for, the average, especially say like an American coming over there, like we were talking about, he's probably not gonna be able to afford to go buy one of those cars and then spend that money to go rent out the tracks. You got to put into, the cost of whatever, a set of Pirelli tires and the fuel and all that. And so it's
Everything that goes into it. I mean, take away even like practice from the perspective. Assume someone gets the right amount of practice and track time. Assume they show up to the race fully prepared to like maximize what they're considering their future opportunity in the race. If you're driving a little hesitant because you know you don't have the budget for the crash damage after the fact, like that's taking practice out of the equation. Now you're trying to factor in, do I make a move for the win or not? Do I
exactly.
push like two, 3/10? And that's how like drivers can go from Ayrton Senna, Max Verstappen to being like self-limiting. It's really easy when budget restrictions start to limit driver potential. And I'd be surprised if some of the F1 guys don't feel those burdens even
Yeah.
being at the back, because those teams with smaller budgets just one don't even have the ability to make a competitive car due to the cost and the aerodynamic development. But those drivers, you can't crash out, or else that's budget that takes away from next season's car development.
Yeah.
These are
It's,
real concerns
you
that
know,
most people view. But that was something that always was on the back of my mind. And I always, when I was driving, was trying to be very conscious of the fact that, hey, budget is what it is. We got to keep the car safe.
yeah.
Um, Maximizing that's really an important skill.
Because if you can go make all the testing in the world, and if you mess up at testing, that puts a wrench in the whole season. When I came out of karts and started doing some the spec Miata testing, those cars, draft so well and all, and so you do a test and there'd be other people there, and those cars, are so dependent on the draft, and so you're able to really do a lot of bumping and banging, and even something like that that's a pretty a fixable fix, it still throws a whole wrench into the rest of the season. And that was I can only imagine what it is, some of these kids coming out of karting and wanting, because, you look
I
at
mean,
the
one set of tires used up at the beginning of the season, you can in the last race of the year use it. All of a sudden, you now have to double stint a set, or you're heading into a 2 hour sprint stint heading into petite, and where you want to compete against the Penskes and all the big budget teams that are throwing on new tires every pit stop, and all of a sudden you have to double stint a set. And on the back half of that second stint, you feel like you're about to crash, completely irrelevant of like
yeah,
your capability, just because you didn't have the $2,000 to $3,000 budget for that extra one set within a set year.
that's why
Um, yeah,
some
absolutely.
you see so many teams not really, especially, I looking at a lot of teams in IMSA, especially in some of the GT classes that aren't getting this big, they've got a factory driver there, they're getting this big factory budget off of him. Those, especially those AM guys, that are mostly AM, qualifying, they only run maybe 3 laps because, they don't got that budget. And so I think some teams would rather take that risk of starting mid-pack towards the back and save something for end of the race and just hope, because that's a lot of that's what you got to do is hope that you know you're at the right point at the right time and you miss something, and it's really
Yeah.
hard, especially take like Daytona, a 24-hour race, because so much can happen right at the beginning, and then the middle be pretty, last few years the middle point of, like this year, the middle
Over
point
pretty, pretty low key. Everyone just kind of holds their spot and tries to make it to the end of the race to have a good last 2 hours.
yeah,
Uh, we were talking a little bit earlier about like electrification and electric cars. What's your opinion on how electric being brought into the DPI class and GTP, how has that affected driver style? How has it affected team management? This kind of like a budget structure. There's so much that's kind of changed in the last 3, 4
yeah.
years.
you
I'd
know
love to
when you were
hear.
getting out of it in 2020 is when you were getting out of it, right? You kind of take that first step back. The
Tapered out 2020.
Yeah, the end of 20 is when they started, Toyota and a lot of these guys started coming out and testing. And so there was a lot of hush, but in 21 was the first race year of it. And so you only had two guys in it. You had Glickenhaus, this, American privateer, which I didn't know a whole lot about them until they really pulled out. You had Toyota. I know that the budget went, in terms, they were able to, the fuel budget for a lot of these teams went down because the more they break, the less the engine is having to run. That hybrid engine kicks on, and essentially, it's kind of like you put a car in neutral going downhill. It kind of, stops a lot of this flow. In terms of what they did in America when they came in 23, there was, I
I
think
would imagine. I would imagine that affects your driving style a lot
it
because if
really did. I
they're
remember,
having braking mid corner, you can't flow as much speed.
yeah, just lap times went down significantly. When you were still
That's
driving, the DPI was the fastest prototype in the world. It was faster than the LMP1. And now, lap times are at Daytona almost 3 to 4 seconds off.
It's horrible.
You know,
Wow.
because I
So they
remember,
really be the P2 cars as well, just to keep the DPIs and GTPs in fun.
yeah, I
I
re
was comparing some of the lap times yesterday to follow up on the Zoom of just like what Road Atlanta has been doing because I have some of my like last official laps, and I was seeing they were like 3 seconds off pace. Road Atlanta's down to like 113 now, and
yeah,
it used to be cars were 110.
and
So the whole series is having to slow down for the electrification of
they
GTPs.
are. The BOP is so different now from when you were in it. It's amazing. I kind of, after we ended, I went back and started just kind of watching some of the, you know, little bits and pieces of some of the races from like 2019, the last, year of DPI where it was really a flourishing class. You still had, yeah, two Acuras. Yet obviously Cadillac in that time was the car to be in because there was so much backing from it. JDC had two cars, Wayne Taylor had one, and then there was the Uncos had one, and then you had the two Mazdas, and you had the one Core Autosport Nissan. And so, even looking back at the races, and that's not been that long ago, 7 years ago, the lap times, y'all were catch or the DPIs would catch it would be a lot longer for y'all to catch the back of the GT cars. Now, when I was at Sebring, by the end of about the fifth lap, the GTP cars could see the
Wow.
tail end of the GTD cars. And I was at the
Is that
beginning of the
a
race, I was kind of on the back end of the track, just out of the hairpin at the hotel, and watching them go down that straightaway to turn 10. They were, and
I
it's,
imagine the it accelerates so quick out of that corner.
oh yeah, it's incredible how quickly they're able to accelerate, but those cars lose so much time under braking.
That
It's
sucks.
it's same with
Yeah,
Formula
that's where,
One
that's where most of driver talent comes in,
is braking.
honestly. It's braking and entry into the corner. It's not the way
And
out.
so now, people like close finishes, but with these GT cars, being in such a what, you more or less have to use them as a pick now because you can't really, there's no spread out racing anymore in IMSA.
So it's all very packed.
It's all very packed, especially, and you go to somewhere like Daytona where the infield's quite narrow.
Mhm.
It's hard to make a lot of passes in the infield at Daytona. It's easy. I would say, when I was at the 24, a lot of the passes, traditionally you see a lot of people able to pass down into turn one, but now it's a lot on the exit of the horseshoes at the international right there. That's turn four, and then at the
Right.
Western. And you see now a lot of them aren't taking the kink flat out. They're having to brake right as they turn into the kink to be able to slow that car down enough to get into the Western horseshoe,
Wow.
which I can remember when you were still in P2 that the kink was flat out.
But yeah,
Yeah, y'all weren't.
sketchy, but easy.
Yeah, it
So
was easy. You could, some of them lifted, but now did I hate to say it though, but I don't think the GTP class is competitive as what they thought.
okay.
I think in terms of driver talent, there's some phenomenal drivers in there. I mean, you got, Acura, you got Colin Braun, Blomqvist, there's some really good names in GTP, and Porsche's got good ones, but the action is in GT.
Is it really?
Yeah,
So has a lot of IMSA's viewership transitioned more towards GTD?
I think so. You
Oh.
know, I can remember when GTP first came.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh no,
I've
it's okay.
downloaded on iRacing some of the GTP cars, and I've tried to give them a few laps because I have some P2 experience, and so I tried to at least like see what these cars are like. And I wasn't fully able to kind of wrap my head around why they tuned them the way that they did. I don't believe iRacing has a direct correlation on
Yeah,
how the car to real life. I'm sure it's significantly improved in real life. But from the feel that I was getting, it seems like, at least in iRacing, they're rear wheel drive only, right? There's no front.
Yeah, that's why they're at the track rear wheel drive.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So it seemed like they were rear wheel drive only. And those cars with the electric motors were putting out more torque on exit than I felt the tire was engineered for the car. So
And
I was trying to like leave some of those corners, and the electric motors with the typical internal
combustion.
combustion. Yeah, I was feeling the back end was just wanting to like step out every single time and spin the back tires. So I think they might have tuned the torque curve to be a little bit unfriendly for the drivers in terms of really maximizing how the car should be raced.
And it's really prevalent to see, like, that point you brought up that on exit of the corners, those cars step out a lot.
Okay.
Y- Yeah, I remember last year at Petit, in the turn 10 A and B, it's really hard to get those cars slowed down coming off that straightaway because when they come out of seven, they're
Have so
hitting
much.
they're hitting maybe 195, and so they're having to brake so much earlier and just kind of roll the car
That's
in.
Hill.
Yeah, it's essentially they're kind of having to fishtail the car, and then on exit going up the hill, they're it's it's the strangest thing from what I was used to with the DPI and the P2. The P2 cars, I don't think have changed a whole lot from the time that you were there. I think they've had to slow them down a lot because down to S's, I think they were, you know, back in, when you were doing it through the S's at Road Atlanta, you were matching DPIs. Y'all could stay
Yeah.
on their tail.
We were actually ahead of them in sector one through turn
Yeah.
one.
And,
Yeah. Like the
and,
P2 car was a better car through the first corner. We
and,
didn't have this into the brake zone. I think it was like a 5 mile an hour deficit, but we were able to roll the speed a little bit better.
you know, and,
So
and that's also why IMSA's doing this whole split start thing because if they did it, a traditional start like when you were there, it would just be calamity corner. No one would probably make it through because the GT cars can match some of these prototypes now, especially like Road Atlanta down to S's.
that's
It's
really like
and
I'm impressed for the GT class, especially with you saying that their viewership's gone up. The fact that they're making those cars so competitive.
I'll tell you this, when you were still in it, I can remember being at, Daytona and some of these tracks and during the autograph sessions, everyone wanted to be at the prototypes because that's where, all the top guys are now. I
Yeah.
was at Road Atlanta. I was walking through the garage during the pilot challenge race going to turn one to watch, going to get some photos of some of the cars for some people and more people now, and I saw this at Daytona this year and Sebring, more people flock to the GT teams than they do the prototypes. Now you
Okay.
got your traditional purists for like Porsche and some of them that are going to, stick it out with Porsche no matter what. But more people now are in tune to GT. And I think I was just at Road Atlanta last month for the GT World Challenge event. I think that's the most people I've seen for, GT racing as a whole. Because,
Really good. I bet that's probably in part due to Chevy's shift to the C8 over the last couple of years.
yeah,
They've really made mid-engine supercars. I'll call it a supercar. It's beating most supercars
yeah.
and hyper now with the Zero One X. Uh,
Um,
they made that level of performance accessible to so many people that now everyone's wanting to watch that racing.
exactly.
Whereas prototypes have become kind of this mythical pack where everyone wants to be from a driver perspective in a prototype because the cars are so fun, but the viewers it's all into what they can relate to and attain.
Yeah,
No one can go out and buy a Aston Martin Valkyrie.
yeah,
So
no. I think even looking at the race, the WEC races or even like Asian Le Mans, European Le Mans, people don't really, I hate to say it, they're not really interested in the prototypes. When the
okay.
prototype, when the GTB came out in 2023, it was such a new concept here in America that that was what everyone wanted to see. There, it was like the next big thing, and so
Mhm.
people were so interested to see what these prototypes could do. Now we're in America 3 years into it. It's kind of like, it's old news, and now, you know, since 20, let's see, 24. You look at the GT class, you've had the new Mustang come out. Corvette's got the new thing. And this year we got the Temerario with Lamborghini.
Oh, that's cool. That's
Yeah,
really cool.
I was at the first testing of it in America at Daytona, was at BOP test at Daytona. And while on paper, I think it's a cool looking car, but it doesn't have that Lamborghini sound. And I think, and
Yeah, they didn't they?
it's the V8 or something like that.
Twin turbo V8, I think they
Yeah,
switched
twin
to.
turbo. It's a
Yeah.
cool car. Sebring was its first
They,
official race.
I think they switched towards like a flat plane crank, but with
Yeah.
two turbos.
Oof.
So I love it from an efficiency perspective, but it's hard to beat the V10
Yeah.
that they.
What the Huracan is, and they're axing them out. There's only one Huracan left in IMSA, and that's the Wayne Taylor's. And so, and, the Temerario for the Super Trofeo series, they're moving to that. And I know some people within Wayne Taylor that says, we'll be testing it towards the end of the season. And so there's a lot of people interested to see how that new Temerario is doing, because it's based off this, the new GT3 car.
Very cool.
Um,
Yeah.
it's kind of like what McLaren's doing. McLaren's built this, single make series here. It's They got one in Europe and America, the Trophy Cup, and it's basically based off the GT4 car.
Mhm.
And so I think these single make series are what's really thriving in within like IMSA and GT World Challenge, that, it everything's basically the same. There's no The only difference is the drivers within the car. I think when you look at
Now, I come from the background of IMSA, so I have a little bit of bias in my perspective,
yeah,
but what is your take on Pirelli's GT series, and have they put together a better program regardless of maybe less viewership? I know back then the cars were a little bit not as beefed up. It seemed to not have prototypes. It didn't really have that edge. But if they're able to like produce a program that's more competitive and driver friendly, I think from
I
a
think
racer
I think they're producing a series that is matching IMSA right now.
matching.
I think
Yeah,
it is on par with IMSA. If you take, exclude the whole prototypes, because the GT program is what is the viewership market in right now. I think that
Mhm.
is what more, it's kind of like, we were talking about, more people are more inclined to watch GTs than they are the prototypes. You talk to anybody of, any of the regular spectators, everyone so agreed that the prototypes are cool, but
Mhm.
more the GT racing is more close knit. It's, or I would say like a real race, a real race put together. The prototypes, they're just, laps ahead, and so it's basically, kind of survive with the prototypes because it's so hard to navigate these GT cars. But that's what's, I think, putting GT on the market. And
Cool.
I think, the GT World Challenge, one thing that they do better than I think IMSA does, all their races are free on YouTube. You don't have to pay for no subscription or nothing. Um, I think that's what's really bringing people into the GT market, is they're watching this GT World Challenge because they can watch the races in Europe, Asia, here in America, all free. And
So they're
it,
getting great color.
yeah,
Yeah,
you know,
better
the
racing.
the
Whereas
bad
we watch and we see the drivers complaining about the fact that like over at what was it, Silverstone, I think it was, where Max passed around the outside of Russell heading into the double S chicanes, and Russell immediately got out of the corner with the battery, whereas Lewis already had the battery reduced.
yeah.
And you race against another guy like that when you're immediately handicapped by a motor pulling 50 horse. It's no longer racing, it's more conserving energy. And so watering down motorsports to kind of go down this path of electrification,
Mhm.
I think has kind of tainted what motorsports is supposed to
Yeah,
be,
I
um,
agree.
regardless of whether it's better for manufacturing production cars or improving the efficiency. I mean, they don't need to use Formula One at this point to propel production cars forwards. We already have Tesla out engineering most of the F1 cars and battery packs
Yeah,
and station performance. So I feel like they've taken what used to be for developing innovation for road cars, pushing the limit of performance, and they've turned it now into, instead of pushing the limit of performance, it's more trying to seem green when motorsports never will be
yeah.
green. Um,
It,
so they've ruined motorsports
it's,
from the perspective of they're trying to over innovate.
it-
Uh, and that's my
no,
opinion from a
I
race.
agree with you there. I wish it
Yeah.
the whole thing was starting about the time you were, kind of stepping away from it. We were in this, a lot of phase in development, and by the end of 2020, beginning of 21 was when this whole thing started taking effect.
Mhm.
When we started seeing these cars actually on track and testing, and it was, there was it was so new that they weren't you didn't know nothing about them really because it was new for the teams. It was, this whole hybrid concept is still really new. And I think, even these, WEC is on this run of where they're getting more manufacturers than IMSA. Next year you don't have, well, this year you had Hyundai or Genesis join. Yeah,
Genesis is a cool brand to have
it is,
into.
yeah. It's a very
Car
neat
looks
brand.
very unique. It looks so
Um,
unique.
and then next year you got McLaren and Ford. And there's talk about there's a Chinese brand wanting to come in. I can't remember the name of it that's looking to come in. And so WEC is becoming now this proving ground that Mark Rushbrook said that at Le Mans when they announced the driver line or the drivers that were going to drive the Ford, they asked him, said, is IMSA, are you wanting to next year do a dual championship in IMSA? And what they said, no. They said at earliest, and McLaren said this, at earliest, maybe 2028 will come, and that would maybe even only be the Rolex. And
Yeah.
so when the convergence thing came out, I thought we were going to see the Ferrari hypercars, Toyota, all these ones want to come over to IMSA, to run because why wouldn't you want to win the Daytona 24 or Sebring 12 Hour and try to chase Triple Crown? The only The only brand that's done customer cars is Porsche, which there's an overabundance of Porsche in both IMSA and WEC, and Ferrari's got one customer car. But with the new the Asian I like what they're doing in Asia though. The Asian Le Mans series is going to add the hypercars, but it's not going to be to they won't have any factory drivers. I think the highest it can be, I think they can have a gold rated, but it's mostly for the silver and bronze rated. And so
Okay.
they're not going to go to any tracks that Hypercar currently races at, which I think is another good thing. And so there's talk. I know Porsche is going to be in it, and it sounds like AF Courses don't have a car. I know there's a guy with a lot of money in England that bought one of the first Peugeot 9X8s, the one with the no rear wing that that was a really cool looking car, is on interim. And there's talk that the Isotta Fraschini that raced in WEC 2 years ago, that there's a team high class racing that used to race here in IMSA has bought that car. So I think that's going to make the series pretty more, I think it's really going to bring more people in Clune to seeing what the hypercars can do, especially at a track they've never been to. And
That'll be
so
neat.
is they're talking about, which I'm pretty sure it's not happened, that they're not to start the season in Europe because Asian Le Mans now is mostly Middle East centered. They go to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and they just have that one race in Sepang. And so I've heard that it'll start like maybe at like Jerez or something. And so I think that's going to be a good thing to tap into for, these people, especially, to see the customer influence into it. and maybe hope that along the line IMSA, because I think the thing with IMSA is when they started the whole GTP that they had to sell, I think I can't remember the number, maybe 1,000 of those cars here in the US. And so, well, I know Toyota sells enough of those because you can't, you go, you leave the house and you see Toyota. And I know Ferrari sells enough of those cars here in the US. You go to any, major US city, you're gonna see Ferraris. Um,
Yeah, I'm surprised for Ferrari to have so few actual customer programs, though. The fact that they've been watered down as a consumer brand, the fact that their racing pedigree has kind of like really left most of North American motorsports and kind of gone more towards Formula One. And I love that they brought in their new prototype. I think that's
yeah,
amazing that
it's a great car.
brought
Um,
in and it looks so good. But from a driver perspective, if that no one's actually driving their cars outside of the manufacturing program, is lack of support? Is it the teams are saying they're too expensive to run?
it's the cars have gotten a lot more. I think DPI was, the top of the top of cost of what a prototype could do.
Okay.
GTP now is coming close to that because those, you know, there's a lot more electrical that's going into those cars than what the DPI was. Yeah, because you're essentially got two engines in the car. You got the combustion engine and you got the hybrid engine. And then with the hybrid, you got to have all these the battery when GTP came out, I remember BMW said that was a 900-watt battery in that car. And so that's a pretty powerful battery right there. And so it's hard to find, I guess, you got to bring in a really significant budget to be able to afford to run one of these cars. And then if you're wanting to run in WEC, you have to mandate two cars.
Yeah.
You can't just run a single. That's the beauty of IMSA is you can run a single entry. Look at like JDC, since they've had the Porsche, they've only ran one car the whole time, and so that's the beauty of IMSA that you don't have to worry about two cars. But especially um last year with Lamborghini when they s- were was the second year of their prototype, they had to pull out essentially just because of the cost.
Yeah.
Lamborghini didn't put into effect. They said it was cheaper for us to develop our GT cars and race those globally than it was to put the money into one hypercar.
Yeah. I'm not
And s-
surprised.
and
I'm
it,
a I'm a big advocate of Porsche as a brand,
mm,
just because like the history of
mm,
Porsche being
mm,
a race pedigree team. I know
mm,
Ferrari is obviously one of like the biggest racing motorsports manufacturers of all time.
mm,
From a driver's perspective, these days, I just don't love what they've done with the whole electrification, the Luce. They've
mm,
shifted their brand away from big V12s.
mm.
I do love their new V12 with the manual that they
Yeah.
just came out. Like for me, they saved their last 2 or 3 years of mistakes just by throwing a manual in that car.
Because and,
I'm
and
like, thank God. But
yeah, the
uh,
manual. I wish more brands would tap into that. I think that could, really help a lot of the car numbers for a lot of brands are on the downside because the cars now are, you read on your phone anytime, so many of these brands are having issues with, it doesn't have just to be the regular cars, trucks, parts aren't
mhm,
lasting, and so you're spending more time with your regular car in the dealership than you are driving it. And so
yeah,
it's,
Ferrari's a garage. So
yeah,
there's that. But
it's really, I think the car market is getting better. And I think,
good.
and I can remember it's, I think we're coming back to that trend where, people now are able to see what the cars can do on track. And so they're seeing them win. And so now people are kind of wanting, it's going back to the old adage that, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And so I think IMSA, or, sports car, not just IMSA, sports car racing as a whole is what's helping that. It used to be
Good.
kind of, NASCAR was kind of that adage, But now I think it's more or less sports car racing is that true win on Sunday, sell on Monday because when you're seeing, let's see, IMSA was just at Canada and I think Porsche won into GT that, it's more inclined people to want to go buy those GT, those cars that are winning.
Yeah.
I,
And I think Cadillac's had a big resurgence in its brand image due to the
yeah.
racing program. I'm seeing there's CT5V Blackwings. They're throwing the Corvette motors in them. They look sporty. They have nice bronze wheels, custom sports packages. Like they've done a really good job with their rebranding. And so for me, seeing the GTP caddies, excuse me, um, as one of like not only I love the Hertz branded one because
Oh
it
yeah.
brings back to the whole original heritage of it. And being an American, I gotta love and support that brand that they have around that car. Um, so it's been nice to watch some of the American manufacturers really take a performance focused identity into this push. And I hope Caddy sells as many as possible because they're one of the brands that I'm really supporting considering how
Yeah.
much they put in this market.
I like the
Yeah.
I really root for what, Action Express has done. I think that's the benchmark Cadillac team here.
Are
I
they?
think really in the world. I think, the Hertz team Joda is they've done really well. They've had a lot of they've been successfully getting better each year with Cadillac and Wegno's just been I feel like on the back foot though but I think Hertz, the Joda team is taking it.
I'll support Action Express over Joda just purely IMSA bias. Like I
Yeah.
love
Was
I do love the Hertz brand though. Racing and motorsports, it makes sense. But is actually which cars are they still doing Mustang sampling?
So that has moved to JDC now.
Okay.
Yeah.
See.
Yeah, so they're back to what they, Mustang sampling on it. But that's on a Porsche though now instead of what it used to be on a Cadillac. But kind of talking on the same topic here. When you were racing, was there this big push to go over to Europe to race as it is now? Or was it kind of, stay where you are and if you're really having that success?
For myself personally, or for like some of my friends that were driving?
Maybe, kind of talk about maybe, a little bit of both on it. Yeah.
For us, we kind of knew our development path. I would have loved to have gone to Europe. Um, the competitiveness of the prototype ladder in Europe is really strong.
Yeah.
And there's as much talent here as there is there. It's just they have more drivers. It's a bigger field. So I wanted to go to Europe for a little bit. The issue is budgets tended to be bigger. The European teams demanded more for less, which was purely the spectacle of, hey, we're going to Le Mans, so we can, for the brand image of the race, charge an exorbitant amount to the sponsors. And then you had to
Yeah.
raise from a driver 4 or 5 times the amount of sponsorship budget. And when you're budgeting yourself out of being able to do events with your existing group and your backing, it became really difficult. I think that European racing has that appeal though to a lot
Yeah.
more of these brands. So if you can find the right group as a driver, the teams, the corporations that you're going to be representing on behalf of, they would love to be at Le Mans.
Oh yeah.
You just got to find them. I never really had that initiative personally to really commit to it. I stayed home. I stayed near my family. I wanted to be local. COVID happened, and we as a family decided to get out and go do some other pretty cool things.
Yeah.
Um, which I'm more than happy that I've made the path that I did. Um, but there was nothing against going over to Europe. I would have I would have died for the opportunity to be in some of those big races.
Yeah.
Absolutely. At least to see if I had what it took to do Le Mans. Le Mans is
Exactly. Pinnacle.
yeah, it's the pinnacle of endurance racing. And who knows, maybe someday in the future we'll all get to go back. But
Yeah. You know, as you look at what the racing scene is now, do you feel for what I don't know if you know really the numbers of what it's costing, would you feel it'd be more cost effective for you to try and get back into prototype racing, or would you be more inclined to maybe try GT cars?
I'm not gonna say it's a waste of experience, but GT cars don't suit what I've developed on
Yeah.
my ladder.
Right.
Like the drive, you can go from being a high level prototype racer into a GT driver. It's really hard to be only conditioned in GT and then learn how to be a prototype racer because of the difference in levels of downforce. I'm more comfortable now that I know it driving downforce at the limit because once you do get fluent, it becomes a little bit easier than a
Mm.
GT car, which is
Right.
always a little bit edge. The cars are heavier, so
Yeah.
when they let go, a GT is more inclined to keep going,
Mm.
whereas the prototypes have the foils. They want to self-correct.
Yeah.
Um, but after having done that development and learning how to drive a prototype, personally, it'd feel like diminishing what I want to be doing in a car to move backwards. Even though that's not the case, GT is more competitive. They have a bigger field. Um, it's better for brand and motorsports. But from my perspective as a driver, I think I would stick with high downforce, whether that be prototype, IndyCar, or like heading over to GP2 and
Yeah.
trying to work my way up the Formula ladder in Europe. That's just because my development path was downforce.
And that's what
Um,
built for your whole career. You
yeah,
started with, the Skip Barber stuff, which was, I guess, kind of like equivalent, like a four car or something like that.
yeah,
And
100%.
and then you moved into the prototype lights, and it was
Which,
just,
by the way, that is an incredible car. No
oh,
matter
those
what I've
were some beasts
those
of
prototype
cars.
lights, amazing.
Those were some great cars, and the racing they put on was
Oh,
some of
good,
the best. And
good.
y'all had the
Competitive,
y'all had the
portable.
first iteration of P3, racing with y'all. And so,
Yeah,
and that was
and we
what
were
really,
right there on the P3s too, as lights cars with half the engine.
and
So
I don't know if
yeah,
you've seen what they're IMSA's doing now. So when
no, I
you
haven't.
got out of it, the prototype challenge was strictly just prototypes, and y'all would run what? Y'all had 2 hour races, and then what, one or two 4 hour, I believe.
Yeah, it was for. I don't think we had any 4 hours. I don't think the cars could last 4 hours
Maybe
for a
it wasn't.
stint.
Maybe it was
Yeah, I
just
think
2 hour.
2 to 2.5 was
Yeah, about the
just in.
max. So,
Um, my favorite was always Trois Rivieras up in Canada.
oh yeah,
I love that track. Such
that's
a
a one I would love to go up to. So when you got out of it, it was still, prototype challenge. And then in 2023, they made this, called it that. They changed it to the VP Sports Car Challenge. So you still had LMP3 as the top class, but they took away the prototype lights and added GT4 into it. And so and they moved it to a sprint format. So it was all 45-minute races. So they did that this 23, 20. Yeah, 24 they moved. No, 24 was still just P3 and GT4. Last year they moved to where they could have not current Evo'd GT3 cars into it along with GT4. So you saw a lot of your AM drivers step into the GT3 car, especially an endurance race weekend. They use that essentially as just a test session to get the guys extra laps in. This year, no one's really entered the GT3 side of it, but USAC has four races that they've turned into endurance races, so they're going back to what the prototype challenge was. And so now when you go next year, IMSA's only don't have two prototype challenge races. The rest of them are going to be sanctioned under USAC, and so they're going to go back to what the prototype challenge was, these 3 hour races, and now they're going to make them a 4 hour. But it's, you got to have one silver and one bronze in it. But I think seeing more of these development paths for the prototype is what is going to get more people, I think, involved in the prototype later down the road. I think that's the best thing IMSA is doing with the development ladder of getting people to prototype.
yeah, very, very cool. I can't speak too much on the development ladder these days. I know there are a lot of teams that put in a lot of energy and effort to develop drivers. Has simulator at all been brought in to kind of what these series and teams are trying to do in terms of picking their drivers,
I
or have
think
they made accessible paths?
I think yes and no. The simulator is kind of I know for people, at least this is in the GT side of it, that a lot of the development drivers when Ford will go to the Ford simulator and they may not necessarily drive the GT3 car for them in real life, but they'll do so much, build the sim work, kind of like what they do Formula One. But I know Porsche has a pretty extensive group of drivers that are the sim drivers that aren't the actual drivers for the GTP.
Okay.
Mhm. And so it's really the sim world now is coming more, as the norm now than what it really. I think
What
more
then what do you
people are relying on the simulator than,
than
well,
ever?
yeah. I'm not saying the sim is bad. I think that's good for, learn, something simple
Great
like,
for
yeah,
at least basics, the
but
fundamental.
nothing beats, at track experience. I would, if it was up to me and I was still in it, I would much rather, pay the money to take, a 3-day test at, any track over sit for
Mhm.
2 hours on the simulator. I think, well,
Yeah.
I think you do learn off
I
the
wish
sim.
instead of doing 15-year-old driver's learners permits and these driving academies on the road, I wish the DMV would send home a steering wheel
Yeah, I know.
and a copy.
But I think,
Have them learn how to at least drive.
I, but for any of the drivers now, I would rather, pay whatever it costs to do a 3-day test at, any of these tracks over the sim. That's just the way I see it. There's a lot that can be learned both sides of it, but I think you learn more about it at, real world experience than sitting with, a headset on.
Yeah, there's something about the actual G-force terrifying you out of what you know you're capable of.
Exactly.
I couldn't imagine what it'd be like being in a fighter pilot.
Oh, I know that I would
Yeah, I couldn't imagine.
imagine,
So
the G-force there,
yeah,
what y'all did in them, in the prototypes was nothing compared to what,
yeah,
they're hitting in one of those. And, you know, v- we had talked about earlier with Verstappen, that's how he's getting drivers for his team is just based off of the sim. And while, I think it's it's a
he's
good
red
tool,
line, right?
do it.
Verstappen's on Team Red Line, right?
I think he's moved to his own team. He's got his own team now, Verstappen.com. And so, um, he's got a guy, Chris Fulham is his kind of main guy that's come from the
Rings sound
sim world to now racing with his GT3 program. But I'm still the same, one of those that thinks any at track day beats a virtual day, virtual 2 hours.
100%.
Um, you just can't beat that at track experience. And because the track changes so much, you know, you may not, for
You
y'all,
can't pick
y'all,
Yeah, you can't pick up the subtle nuances. And even if you can master and I think we touched on this yesterday, at least like from my perspective, I agree with you wholeheartedly because I believe a simulator is only really good for developing the fundamentals
right.
and understanding a car's limit to your driving technique because you're constantly adjusting for the plus minus, or at least that's what I believe you should be using the sim
Hmm.
for trying to like change your driving lines for the plus minus, but you're never going to pick up on the actual asphalt changes, um, the bumps at specific points of a corner, like in turn one over at Sebring or 17, where you're bouncing the car just underneath the bridge as you're like coming around the corner. There's so much that you learn in a real car that a simulator will never portray, and it
Right.
can't.
And those,
So
I'm sure you've probably seen, the pictures of like those Formula One simulators that, that can roll, that simulate what the car is feeling. I think, it's like we said, gives you a false feeling.
false
Yeah, false
sense.
sense.
My
And
perspective makes sense. Yeah, because even if they can simulate every bump, it's not real G-force throwing you. So, like the G-force throws you into the actual side of the seat. You
right.
understand?
Yeah.
experience. I understand it from my experience. The sim just bouncing around in a little room is not going to give you three
No.
Gs. And that's the type of actual like experience that scares you out of driving to what you know you're
Your
actually
limit.
capable.
Yeah.
And talked about that with perspective the other day between um, open cockpit and closed cockpit. Like all of these different experiences are something that, from a driver's perspective, restrict you. If you have any fear at all, you're gonna be afraid to drive to your limit.
Yeah.
And I think sim doesn't capture. And Max is so good. He's really gifted, like by far one of the best in everything he does. But you can see him hop into a sim, you can see him hop into a GT car, and you can see him hop into an F1 car. And with each different variation, he's at the limit of what he's capable of doing because he's come from Formula One. He has no fear of any other type of perspective or force on him. A GT car is slow compared to an F1
Oh,
car.
absolutely.
Slow. Um, if a sim guy tried who might like, let's say one of his sim teammates is faster than him in every car possible. If one of his sim teammates that's never raced in a real car tried to go and race Max in any other car, there would be a big gap to start. And up until he got rid of all of his fear and learned how to adjust to the forces that you actually feel in a real car. Even though he might have the talent or the capability to push that last nth degree of driving capability, it's different. Um, so I look at it from that perspective, and I really hope Sim kind of creates a big development ladder. Like
I do too.
I love that they're starting to do that a little bit more.
Yeah. Um, I think people see what everybody knows that story about Jan Mardenborough with Gran Turismo and this whole sim thing, but you know, I think now we're at the point where we're kind of past that, but we can build something better than what, was started. I guess that's been what, 15
Yeah,
years ago, 10, 15 years ago. I think there's so much now. The technology. I mean, you hear about it all the time. They're rescanning tracks all the time to get that new feel for them on the simulator. And
yeah,
because tracks change every day because, water might not be a race at them every weekend. There's all kinds of track days or private testing. So stuff changes just over, day by day by those tracks. I
yeah,
mean,
and like you were saying, technology's advanced so much in the last 3 years alone. And like AI has gotten so good. I don't believe they have any AI into those platforms, but I signed on to iRacing for the first time over those last couple months, and I saw they have rain driving now. And I threw a couple laps, and it by no means was any translation to what I'm used to from like a real car. The cars wanted to really stay their line. They wanted to correct themselves. And I'm like, okay, a real car would have crashed already like 40 times over.
oh yeah.
But as they throw on sensors onto a race car or they start using AI to actually analyze live racing, you can immediately just overlay that data and information into the sim and quickly start making these programs so much more realistic to where it'll be impossible for a sim guy to go into that Nissan experience and have the same issues.
Yeah.
Like I really hope out and with the tech accelerating so drastically, all these big teams, OpenAI now in IndyCar, um, there's the funding around.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Look how many of them are, hopping in on the sponsorship. That's what's funded so much of the Meyer Shank team in IMSA. The 60 car is a open AI team that's, funding that whole program. And so I hope more of these, companies like that are willing to invest in it
I
because,
really hope,
at the
yeah,
end of the day,
great for the sport.
yeah, at the
So
end of the day, any direction, any positive direction the sport can go in is going to, help it. And that's what's ultimately going to get more people involved into it. I think, the sim is, like we said, the sim is good for, fundamentals. And I think for getting people interested into the sport, but, nothing's going to beat the real world track. And
right.
and I think now the way the sim is, a lot of people now are bypassing the karting. People aren't doing that traditional step like I did, and spend 10 years in karting, I may have spent a lot, I think 10 years is a lot longer than most people did, but ultimately that's the path I took of it was 10, I did 10 years of karting. And while, at the end of the day, I got to test some, actual cars. And so I understand, the feeling of these tracks. But now you see a lot of people now where I look at what they're doing here, in the whole, road to Indy. So many of these guys are just hopping straight into like F4 or something,
Are they
like yeah.
that is
They're just, hopping straight into like F4. I would really be interested to do there's a track here in Georgia, Atlanta Motorsports Park, and they have what they call the Primal Racing School, which is the radicals, the SR, I think the SR, what is it, SR5 or something like I can't
yeah.
remember what.
There's the SR3. I remember the three and then the eight.
So I think it's the three, maybe it's the three. I can't remember which
Three
one
is
it
like
is.
a liter bike. So that's a little four-cylinder 1000 cc, or maybe it's like 1500 cc.
Something I would really be interested to, as someone that's, raced and understand a lot of this stuff, jump into one of these like race schools and really see what it's, really like. What are they
You're
really teaching you? Because I'll tell
right.
you, I'll tell you a cool story here. When I stopped racing and when I turned 18, I wanted to still stay involved in the sport, and so I knew a lot of people, and I didn't really know what direction I wanted to take it in. And so somebody
Yeah.
told me, said, "Well, why don't you pick up, doing something maybe like timing and scoring?" Because and I was like, "Well, I didn't really want to do that." But what I ended up picking up was end up started corner marshaling, and so I got a really, new perspective on how a race works from the sense of,
The
seeing. And
penalties.
yeah, and what was cool was I was seeing, because the first race weekend I worked as a corner marshal, was the driver school. SCCA had a driver school at Roebling Road, and that's 45 minutes from my house. And seeing what I was taught, and so I was probably gonna go into one of those driver schools coming out of karting, and so I was testing. And what I was used to seeing, the lines they were running and the way they were taught was so much
As a,
different.
yeah, as a corner marshal, you have to view like safety. You
Yeah.
have to be concerned about all these. I couldn't even imagine the change in perspective you had to go through.
So the first,
Well, how does that kind of a perspective shift affect your view on something like what happened to Lewis in that final race where they threw the yellow flag, Max ended up winning, took it from Lewis, like because that's to me one of the big regulation slash marshaling experiences over the last couple of years in motorsports. How did that shift from racing to actually being in a position where you're responsible for the driver's safeties
I think,
change your uh,
from that perspective, I think that was probably one of the most unsafe things because they put the cars back green when there was still marshals and other, they were still cleaning them. The was who I can't remember if it was Perez or whoever had wrecked right there. They still had not gotten the track completely cleaned, and
so they should have never actually restarted it at
they
that point.
shouldn't. No, even though that was on the back half of the circuit, it was going to be a minute 20 or so before the cars got there. I think that was probably the worst thing that they could have done. And that's
Yeah,
the
I didn't even,
whole
that's interesting because that no one talks about that.
no.
Like
And so,
everyone was like, oh, they slowed instead of doing a full course yellow
um,
safety car,
or
the
they
cars keep their gap, they gapped them, and everyone makes it about that, but they shouldn't have even gone to start the
no, they
race.
shouldn't have started it. And so I think, you know,
Interesting.
I like about the club when I work a lot, I still work a lot of those. I like that, some tracks, especially when I go to like Daytona, Road Atlanta, or Sebring work those events. The marshals are not allowed on track to go assess, if a car hits a barrier in front of you, they won't let you on that side. Or even something simple just to go pick up a piece of debris. They don't want the marshals on track because it's so much of a safety concern. But you go somewhere like Roebling Road, the marshals are, encouraged to, go out and, pick up that piece of debris or, and check the track because so much can, a lot of stuff can happen that you can't see. A lot, sometimes you can't see that, oil or fluid that's coming out the back of, the back end of a car. And as a driver, a lot of times you don't know until it's too late that you've, lost fluid. And
Yeah.
so I think that's, looking at the race from the perspective of how I've seen it, it's so different because I don't do them as much anymore because I like doing the media side of stuff now. But when I was doing IMSA races, I realized how much, information that we give puts into what happens in race control. You know, Daytona, they've got cameras everywhere. They know if you turn around and, look the other way. And but they still want as much information as given. And that's the
I
thing.
you guys are so like directly involved at a track like Sebring.
Yeah,
Every marshal has to be, I would
yeah.
imagine.
This year with the whole what happened at the Rolex when the whole fog, happened. Um, the rule is in corner marshaling is you need to be able to see the station prior to you and the state and then following station. At Daytona, at the chicane, they couldn't. The marshals over there were telling me they couldn't even see NASCAR turn three. The whole, back straightaway coming from NASCAR two, you couldn't see nothing until the cars made the chicane there.
The yellow
And
flag
yeah, they
race.
could, essentially, you know. That was the only call they could have made was to, I think, really, I have a friend that was in timing and that works with Alcamel and said that the reason they did not stop that race was because if they were to stop it, the whole cool down process of the hybrid and re-warming of the hybrid would have made it would have essentially killed the race even more than what it was, you know. Still, I think they did 6 or 7 hours under full course yellow.
That's
That,
brutal.
yeah, especially
Really?
especially people that corner marshaled, standing out there and just holding that full course yellow flag out, for hours upon hours.
Yeah. Without
Um,
having to switch or being able to. That's brutal.
yeah, it's interesting. I've flagged at Daytona, Sebring, and Atlanta with IMSA. Daytona and Sebring do it pretty good where you get shifts, and so it gives you enough time to kind of, especially like Daytona, you only work 8 hours at the race. You work four on
Mhm.
Saturday and four on Sunday, so the rest of the time you can rest or watch the race. But road Atlanta, it's hard on the marshals because Atlanta, you would think they would want to get this mass influx of people wanting to sign up to work because that's one of the biggest races of the season is Petit Le Mans. You
Mhm.
don't. I think
Everyone wants to win it.
that would be one of the races I would, give anything to win. You know,
I would have won that. I was the only one.
I flagged the last year I
Trash.
did. The last year I did it in 24, I did 7.5 hours
I did.
continuous. Yeah.
That's
And so marshalling now is a kind of a dying thing. It's hard to get people really to want to do it. And Daytona and Sebring I haven't been
I
to
mean,
Atlanta.
being out on that corner could be
Oh, it
brutal.
is. It's brutal, like, and raining and this year, I couldn't imagine. I was at Road Atlanta for the SGT World Challenge. It was feels like into triple digits. And, just standing there just for a few minutes watching, it takes
Oh,
that toll. It
track
takes
temp on like a 95-degree day would be like 140.
Yeah.
So
And I was talking with a couple of the drivers and they said it's gonna hit, probably 150 inside the car. Easy. And
it was like that at Watkins for me the last year I raced. When we were in P2 in 18 and 19, the Watkins track was, I think it was, I don't know which of the 2 years, but it was like 145 in car temp. It was utterly brutal. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It made for a good experience, but yeah, it gets pretty treacherous in there.
I can imagine, getting out of the car after a stint, probably were, were they giving y'all a lot of IVs, try to replenish fluids?
over back into medic just to grab an IV to get
Yeah,
refreshed.
but I can, only imagine. Even, sometimes on the, like Daytona, some years it's pretty cool there, and some years it's, warm. I can even imagine on some of the colder days that you would still probably want to, get some replenishment of it. Because,
Yeah,
a lot of, you see a lot of these young kids that coming into racing and, they don't take into account, how bad the heat and cold can affect you. That's
yeah,
that's what hurts a lot of these guys that they can't, they
can't.
think they can, on paper, a 2 hour stint doesn't seem like that long, but but in car, when you're with that heat, and even if the cool, what if you have a cool suit and it fails and you're sitting there with that, water on you for 2 hours, it
Yeah, because the cool suit starts becoming like boiled water at that point.
exactly, yeah. And some of them, they run the fans, in the helmet fans, and but a lot of times I hear, in some of those series teams tell them don't run it because it's taking more power away from the engine that, you're losing a lot of time on it. And so,
Extra weight. I feel like those kinds of comforts I never got to like dabble with. Uh, but from my perspective on like Daytona, where we had open cockpit, pouring rain, 30 degrees, and then 150 degrees in the LMP2 car at Watkins. I've experienced both utterly polar opposites. I haven't raced in snow. Um, but if I'm gonna pick one, I'm gonna pick driving in the heat for 2 hours over like a 3 hour stint in the rain where you're frozen.
yeah,
Um, Watkins is brutal just because of how long the corners are. So like if you have the carousel and you're in, and you were talking about that 2 hour stint being a long time. 2 hours is a very long time in a car for an
right.
extended, it's easy to do a lap, to do 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It physically is not that taxing. But when you're on that limit racing for 2 hours, the F1 guys get out of their cars and they're pretty exhausted.
Yeah.
And F1 comes at it from a perspective of these guys are 5'7", 5'8". They're lying down, right? So if you look at a GT car, you sit upright. If you're in an F1 car, you're actually lying down in the
No.
car, it's folded around you. So they're pulling way more G's, but a GT guy is physically going to have to be a little bit more fit, minus the fact that like the F1 guys need to really strengthen their necks. Like you look at George Russell, he's not like a big strong guy. He's
Yeah.
a thin person. Some of these GT guys are going to be in way better shape than an F1 guy, purely from my perspective, off the fact that the physics is against them. An F1 guy is strapped into a seat where his torso doesn't need to be rigid and locked. A GT guy, 2.5 hours being upright in a car, his lower back muscles, he's going to be working it a lot harder. And so there are these like subtle perspectives that the outside world doesn't understand into what the car differences are like. And a great example for me was prototype lights.
Mhm.
One of the best cars I've ever driven. Also, the only car that didn't have power steering. Uh, and so you get this perspective of Formula One car, power steering, LMP2 car, power steering, prototype lights, the slowest car I could drive in that list of like GTPs, GTDs. Um, but I had no power steering. And so going around a corner like the carousel at Watkins, and it's a downforce car. So if it were no power steering without the downforce,
Mhm.
the car wouldn't be as heavy. But we had downforce on those cars. And so as you get to the back half of the carousel, when the downforce is really squashing the car into the ground, the casters really rolled forwards, you're rotating. It was physically opening the steering wheel. I was not at that time strong enough to keep the steering wheel into the corner. And we're going 200 like an F1 car, but
Yeah.
I physically not do it. And so after 2 hours of trying to withstand that in a slower car where it's kind of engineered in a way where it's physically more demanding, that like I could feel my tendons kind of like vibrating after the end of the race. When you're under that stress and you can feel the elasticity in your fingers, uh, it's a different perspective, but it's something that I think is cool to talk about because it's not really something that most people understand about the differences in motorsports,
It
and
really,
everyone talks about F1, the most that you have to take into account.
you know,
So
when you had Pato as your teammate in 17 and let's see, he did that. And what was it? The next year he started, transitioning more to the, IndyCar, road to IndyCar stuff. And then I guess it was 21 or 22, he got that first test with McLaren. And it's like he said, the most physically demanding part of the whole F1 deal is just, the neck on, the neck is the part that's the most demanding part. And those cars, you know, he comes from IndyCar that's no power steering or anything, and you're trying to rip that car around, like tonight there at Nashville, that's a oval that's really, there's no straightaway on it. It's one of those ovals that's really, you're really, ripping it around, turning the whole time. And so I think, the Indy car is one of the, for him, probably the most physically demanding car there.
100%. I could
Yeah.
imagine 100%. And it's cool to see someone like Pato be able to go do both
Oh,
and
yeah.
explain. I'm honestly so happy for how he's done and how his career's progressed.
I like that he's someone that's out there that's willing to tell the negative about Formula One because all you hear is all this, oh, Formula One is, so great and all. This has been, I think, the best year for publicity of Formula One that's telling the people that the cars, people don't want, the teams don't want all this coming out that the cars suck. But I think they're,
From my yeah,
yeah, I think this is the best thing that's happened. Someone like Pato that's been right in the thick of it with McLaren, even though he hasn't his mileage in the current cars is, fewer than some of them. He's got, FP1s and most of his testing was in at least a 2-year-old car though. But, you
yeah,
know, it's like, he said that he's asked for him to take away from his, testing duties. And so I think that's probably something, Formula One, I probably does not like that they're hearing someone, within that inner circle telling them, that this car is terrible because you notice Verstappen's been one of those guys that's, pretty, outspoken guy that'll tell you, he's not no, there's some drivers that'll kind of sugarcoat it. Verstappen's gonna tell you it sucks. I think you need
yeah.
more of that in motorsport,
Mhm.
and
I agree with
I think that's what's really, Formula One. I think is always gonna be on this pedestal though, but it's like said earlier, why wake up for at 6 in the morning to watch one of the races that if you qualify in the top three, so pretty much stay the same for 50 laps when you can go, watch some
you.
of
It's
these other races that,
not the
you know,
same. So just
you know,
so
and then, an IMSA sprint race is close, maybe just a little longer than a regular F1 race.
mm,
And, pretty much anybody can win it. Any of
yeah,
the classes, I would
that's how the
much rather, I think that's
it's a fair.
more bang for your buck. If you're, I tell people all the time, all my friends ask me, like, why don't you ever go to Formula One? And I say, well, you know, the cost is not worth it.
Yeah,
You know,
100%.
sure, don't get me wrong, I would love to,
Earlier, we'd rather watch it on TV.
yeah, I would love to, sit there, Eau Rouge and Radion and watch them go up that hill. Like, I would not turn that away, turn that down, but I tell people all the time, go watch IMSA. I think it's much, any of that, sports car
Race.
racing.
Yeah, it's better racing for sure.
People, I take some of my friends, try to take a few of them every year to, a race that never experienced it. And, they see this stuff on TV. And I tell them, it's way cooler being at it in person than it is on TV because, you don't feel that ground, this year or since GTP came out, the Cadillac, you don't feel that ground effect on TV. When that thing goes by you, whether you're on a straightaway or a turn, you feel, the Cadillac has such a raw engine in it that it moves the ground. Whether you're in the main grandstands at Daytona or just standing by the fence at trackside, that car
Awesome.
it physically, it feels you'll feel it to your core when that Cadillac goes by. And that's what, all the Formula One cars really sound the same to me.
Yeah, yeah, they do.
At sports car racing, you can tell what a Cadillac is, the Valkyrie or whatever it is. When that car goes by that it's that car. And all the Formula One cars look the same. It's a,
They- they do.
it,
And I was most proud this year to see the engineering that went into Ferrari's chassis.
yeah.
Not chassis, to their engine development
Mm,
program. I was genuinely rooting for them to have the best motor, regardless of Mercedes's compression trick, which was
mhm,
brilliant. Um, so much of Formula One is how do you get off the starting point
mm,
and can you control the race from the front?
mm,
And so the fact that Ferrari went with the smaller turbos to be a little bit quicker off the line with better spooling, I was like, yes, they're finally going to have a strong year. They're being strategic. They've committed the right engineering to the right like innovation. And so I was so excited heading into the season. And I hope Lewis stays for at least maybe two more seasons with Ferrari
I
and
hope
give
so.
because I really think they're on the right path.
Yeah, I
So
think bringing someone like Lewis in is, helped Ferrari a lot more. Well, when when he announced the Ferrari, I was a little skeptical of it because I thought, you have a solid lineup of Leclerc and Sainz. I thought, why kind of ruin a good thing because those two were really gelling together. But now
yeah,
that, the first year of Lewis at Ferrari was kind of a disaster. The only podium he got one podium, and that was the first year that, his whole Formula One career he didn't win a race. I think was that first year at Ferrari, or maybe or it was something like that. But now that he's kind of gotten over that hump and been able to, figure it out what's going on at Ferrari, Ferrari's taking a step in the right direction that I think they're more competitive that they were than when it was Sainz and Leclerc, even those latter years of Vettel.
uh, yeah, yeah. Vettel's final years were amazing. It's fun.
And you know, Formula One is so much now that the engineering matters so much more than really anything
Driver.
else. Those
Yeah.
guys, that's what, other than the driver, that's where the money is, what's, getting put into Formula One. And so,
If I were to try
you
and deal racing team in F1, I would put 99% of the budget towards car.
yeah.
And I'd pick the best American drivers that don't want a $40 million salary
Uh,
because that actually is 40 million in wind tunnel testing.
you know, I read somewhere that, even some of those, like Haas, Ocon is, he's just, hit 10 years in Formula One and he's still only barely pulling in over just a couple million.
Okay.
It's not, I think, there's this whole misconception that these Formula One guys, if you're not at, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, one of these top three teams, you're not pulling over, this, huge money, that, you're thinking, those guys at Williams and all, most of them
Yeah,
are paying to be there.
the brand image and stuff like that. So
Yeah. Most, and making very little. And it's like, you talked about, I think you get more bang for your buck coming to something like sports cars, it's cheaper. you
Mhm.
know, Look how much some of those guys spent, from the time they left karts to, starting something like F4, some of those junior series in Europe, how much money they were spending and how much money you could have saved, if you went the sports car route. Even then,
And had a shot at a real career,
yeah.
like a career too. So
I,
sports car racing is, I agree with you. Sports car racing is definitely where the best of motorsports is
you
these
know,
days.
if I was able to, do it, start from karts and I think I wish I would have paid more attention to what, happened in sports cars than trying to. Because I think, every, kid when they're coming out to karting, it's got this, idea in their mind that I'm gonna go to Formula One, and very few of them do. And you know, look how many of them in, Formula Two are signed under, a development contract. I think, I think it's good
Yeah,
that
but
they give,
having the opportunity of a development contract is so rare.
you know,
The few development stories out of karting where the guy got a manufacturer's contract, wound up being like Lewis, where he
Yeah,
gets that support.
I
And then
think
you're
it,
just a really good ladder. So like that's hard. It's rare, but the sport needs more of it.
I
So
think it's good that they give some of these, young guys opportunities to test the older cars, but at the end of the day, there's really no solid path to Formula One because I liked the way IndyCar did it when you would win the Indy Lights Championship. You had that, you get a guaranteed season in IndyCar. You win the Formula Two Championship. There's no guarantee you don't have a Formula because they signed those guys to such long-term deals.
yeah, yeah.
And
You're gonna run out of your own budget before you even get the opportunity.
yeah, and so I think that's why you see some of those European guys coming, wanting to do IndyCar and coming to Indy Lights. Um,
Mhm.
look at what Enzo Fittipaldi's done. He was, under that Red Bull ladder. You know, I don't even think he got to test Indy cars. I think he just got to maybe do a few sim days with the Red Bull team, and that was it. You know,
Cool.
and
Very-
but I think you've got a better shot coming. I think there's people realizing there's a better shot of making a career in the sport or in the open wheel ladder here in America than it
Yeah,
is over there.
absolutely.
You know, you look at so
I
many of those guys that win the F2 championship and make FP1, and that's it.
yeah, yeah.
I would hate
I
to know that's how my career. I spent all that money, and I would much rather I would much rather spend the money and go pursue sports cars and maybe win win
yeah. It
win.
doesn't be desired when you spend all your budget in a Formula ladder and you get there and you're at the top of F2 and
Yeah,
there's nowhere to go.
that
You
was
just
kind of like what happened to that Teo Porcher. He had
was
so many teams caught wanting at him, and at the end of the day, they went with whoever brought the budget. It's kind of like, in 21 with Mazepin. No one wanted the guy, Nikita Mazepin, but because
yeah,
he brought so much of that money in, why
yeah.
turn, especially a struggling team like Haas, you know, why turn that,
I'll
however,
turn it down.
hundreds of millions he was, even though it was kind of, even when you look at it, like, why would you choose the guy? But, at the end of the day, they needed the money because without that money, that, they probably wouldn't have made half the season. And so that's the bad thing about the sport. That's what I tell people, you know,
It's ups and downs. I hope some better sponsors come in. I hope they figure out some better development channels for us younger guys that are trying to have careers in the sport. Um, I think we have a good perspective on it because we've seen the inside, seen the outside,
yeah,
and we've been on that path
uh,
of trying to making it and I don't necessarily know if I would have any like real what is there one definitive answer that motorsports can do to fix it. Um, but I'm gonna keep enjoying watching. I'm gonna
yeah. I, I enjoy watching it, and seeing it.
motorsports.
Yeah,
Um, so I hope they do figure out the at track viewership though.
yeah.
Being at being at the Las Vegas race, being in the actual paddock, having paddock passes and being in some of their grandstands, I was really disappointed to know that I'd rather watch it on TV.
You know,
Um, if the spectacle is for the experience, they need to at least make it about the at track experience for the people watching.
I
So
think that's the other thing that IMSA and some of these sports car series get it right. You don't have to buy extra to get, you can if you're general admission IMSA ticket, you can go in the garage and be bumping shoulders with these guys and
meet all
standing
the
in line.
drivers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can stand. Every driver's at that autograph session. There's ample opportunities, to meet these people. You look
And
at
you can corner, you can see the whole race from wherever you want.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was shocked at the F1 race when I was trying to watch the race and I was behind a railing of like 4 or 5 rows of people and I couldn't see over the group and I'm like, we're supposed to be in some sort of an environment where like we're treated and they just want us to sit on the couches in the lounge and watch it from their TVs at the track. And
The
I'm
thing
like,
I hate
so
I hate about Formula One is that now it's more about, they bring all these celebrities there and it's about getting the likes on Instagram. It's not, those celebrities have no idea what really, happens. Sure, they might
not
be
a
friends with Lewis Hamilton or whatever, but they
yeah,
really
which
don't know what's happening. It's like when uh what was it, 2 years ago when they filmed the Formula One
from
movie.
my perspective, nor should anyone really care too much about their opinions of what goes on in motorsports. You're 100% right. It's viewership.
You know, they always, you always see this, you look on TV, when Formula One was on ESPN, they do the grid walk and you'd see
Yeah.
movie star, Tom Cruise, you name it, people that, well, I mean, sure, it's cool that, that they're there. That gives, some incentive, but do they really know what's going on in those races? No. It's like when Formula One made the movie a couple of years ago when they filmed it at Daytona, filmed the opening part at Daytona. That movie didn't touch half of what happens, for a Daytona 24 to go right. I think that would be the best thing for sports car racing is to have another like Ford versus Ferrari movie.
Mhm. It would be amazing.
That would,
Like we need that. When we have a guy like Max saying that like the cars aren't drivable, someone's got to start listening.
yeah,
So
that's the
yeah,
hopefully, all we can, all me and you can do is, hope someone opens their ears and, says, something's got
we
to
need it.
change.
So yeah,
And it's,
it'll come. I think they're starting to see the writing on the wall.
oh, I think so.
So
And,
and this might shift away from this whole hybrid era into, hey, let's bring back some motors that are 10 cylinders, 12 cylinders, or at least find out how to make those more efficient if we already have batteries in it.
right.
Like we're pigeonholing ourselves into an area that we've so perfected, but not so efficient with energy recovery systems. And we've met all our goals over the last 7 or 8 years of trying to develop these hybrid platforms. Why not bring back a bigger motor?
Because,
Like,
now it's all about conserving that battery. Formula
yeah,
One. I didn't watch all the spa race this morning, but saw a lot of, the end of it. And it was, the laps that they're running now. It's like, we were talking about with GTP, they're so much slower because, they're just riding to conserve that battery, that ERS. And,
it's
since they take away, I guess they kind of taken away, but also didn't the DRS that, we've been so, used to. I think
yeah.
that's really had a kind of a negative effect on the series.
Mhm.
And
I
that's
100%. And it makes it hard to like have a driver style that's more managing energy recovery than
yeah.
race. Because I remember being able to fuel save and having to do recovery stints and like practicing for that and trying to let off a little early, brake a little bit deeper, just to maintain the lap time while saving. But when that's your standard driving style, like I couldn't
Yeah.
imagine trying to race every lap.
Yeah. And and somewhere like
Eh,
Spa that's so long.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Spa is
That's
such a cool. That's a
I would
bucket list for me.
that's yeah,
Oh,
I would love to, spectate or even just do like a track day or something there.
yeah, it'd be awesome.
Mm.
So that's in the cards in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, I
Well,
sure would.
I would love.
I was telling someone, I said, when I finish medical school, I think I want to take like a month to, just go over, to Europe, just experience so many races.
Absolutely. I fully recommend. Um, what parts of Europe would you like to go to
I'd like
mostly?
to go to England. I think England's got so many, historic tracks.
Silverstone and yeah.
You know,
I,
I would like to see a lot of these, tracks that aren't, heavily like media sized. Some of these like small local ones too, in a way. Kind of like what England does. England has, so many great series that don't leave England. And,
yeah.
obviously I'd love to go to France. I'd love to see, Le Mans, I mean, why wouldn't you want to see Le Mans? But, Magny Cours is always a good one. Paul Ricard, Germany, you got Nürburgring and
Mhm.
there's so many great tracks. I'd love to just see, as much as I can because I think there's so many. untapped markets there of these
Yeah.
tracks. You know, some of these local tracks, I think sometimes can put on a better race than some of these, big tracks.
Mhm. That's true.
You know,
That's true.
that's what,
Yeah.
I think that's what Formula One needs to quit doing with the street circuits and go to more of these, regular tracks, permanent circuits. I know next year they're adding Istanbul in Turkey. That's one of the best tracks that I remember Formula One going to. They went there during COVID just because they needed to fill something in. I think Portimao in Portugal is another great example. You know, the Nürburgring GP circuit is another good one that Formula One used to go to. Why not, go back or, Imola.
Yeah.
There's so many great tracks in Europe that Formula One or, not just Formula One, WEC, so many of these major series aren't going to because they're so dead set on street circuits. And it's like I said earlier, I'm not a, s- I don't really like street circuits, but I'm also not against them. I think some are better than others.
I mean, they equate to really competitive racing,
They do.
and good street course will kind of balance out the drivers to the car disadvantage. So, I think you're
Um,
spot on.
and a lot of street circuits stay on the calendar just because of the history. I mean, look, Monaco will probably never go away just because of the history. But
It's a really,
or,
yeah,
take here in America, Long Beach. I don't foresee Long Beach ever going away anytime soon.
I really hope it never does. Like,
But
unless California gets too restrictive on their like governmental policies, I really hope Long Beach stays for the long haul.
But here's the thing about street circuits. When they, get one, the first, they sign it first to a 3-year contract because the first year of it, there's, no money made because they're having to pay, whatever city, X amount of dollars to close these roads, put up all these barriers, so much stuff goes into that. By the second year, they're supposed to see a slight profit made. Obviously not a lot, but by the end of the third year, there should be a pretty good profit made to, for not only the series but that city to foresee, why don't next year we, bring this back? I think that's what kills a lot of street circuits is that, people don't see the racing product as a whole, that they
Mhm.
kind of go for the party vibe of it. And
That's true.
I think that's what kills a lot of these places, street circuits. Like, I think Vegas just got signed to, a pretty long-term deal.
Did they actually?
I think they did. I think I remember hearing that they got signed to a pretty, extensive long-term deal. I'm interested to see, that new street circuit they're getting in Washington for the Indy cars, how that's gonna work.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah, I'm
That'll be
really
really,
interested to see how
yeah.
that works.
I like that it's being promoted too.
I do
So
too.
very much so.
I
It's a
think,
neat in front of the White House. That was
that's
cool.
that's really cool. I hope that can, obviously we'll just have to wait see how it runs, but it would be cool if that could get signed on to maybe a contract, they bring it back. I know there's
Yeah.
talk about the NASCAR street circuit they just did at San Diego on the naval base that they're wanting to bring that back because the product turned out so good and I think it tapped into that market there in California. I think California is always known for this big car culture, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of the racing doesn't get tapped in. I think California's got some of the best tracks. You got Laguna, um, Long Beach, Sonoma, so I think that's, really helping. The street circuits can be a blessing and a curse to the series because they can, lose a lot of because it costs a lot of money to rent out, wherever they're wanting to go to.
Yeah. Very much so.
So that can really, really hurt you and it can really help. And I think that's what
Mhm.
kind of I think NASCAR that kind of put them back on the upswing with the whole Chicago deal and with SVG. More people are now wanting to kind of, pay attention to NASCAR just to see what he does. Because,
Yeah.
you look at the numbers on the road courses since he's come to it, I think he's only lost 2 of them since he's been
Does
in
he?
it. Yeah.
That's good.
He's,
That's really good.
really become this dominant force now. It's kind of like some of those older guys, I can remember one, Montoya was in NASCAR, he was killer on the road courses, but when it came to an oval, he was at the back, but the cars are so used to what he's was driving in Australia that he's really figured it out, that he's, starting to kind of run up front at some of these ovals. So I think that's given, I think that gives more people incentive to maybe step out of what they're used to and try something new.
Okay.
Because I like an all-round driver. I really, that's what I really wish I was better at, was being a more all-round driver. Because I never tried anything like an oval in my time. I was strictly a
Uh,
road course guy.
course, yeah. See, I was strictly road course, but with your experience on a road course, I'd say you transition into oval
Well,
easily had you
I
made the
really,
switch.
I wouldn't mind any opportunity to try it. Just a test or something. I think
I'm
that would.
sure it would have been something that would have been so cool.
Oh, I would love to. That's the cool part about where I am. And in Georgia right here, there's a lot of. Oh, I don't think I really want to try the dirt one because that's a whole different skill set. But a short oval, concrete oval, something like that, I could probably fit in pretty well with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, especially
Because
with what would your timeline be out of med school on
I got
trying to like get
about another year and a half.
a year and a half?
Yeah, so not too much longer.
It's another almost 2 years in the thick of it.
But yeah, that
That'll be good.
was when I stepped out of racing, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I really didn't. I figured, because I was so dead set on, I'm gonna make racing this, whole career, and I'm not to worry about it.
Yeah.
When I was still in middle high school when I stopped racing, and then I kind of woke up and realized, the world, you need to go to college. I thought, that
Oh,
was,
well, I managed against it just out of unfortunate scenarios, but
yeah,
you do go to college. I
it's,
think I think it's the most important lesson for teaching yourself how to finish.
yeah,
And my situation, I was a little naive and young, and I stayed in college for a short period of time. I was fully committed to being a professional racing driver, and I was, you know what? I'm stubborn. I dropped the whole college thing. It it's something that I wish I executed and stayed through. So at least for the fact that it would have made my dad a little bit more okay with it from a family perspective,
right.
because something that our family has always viewed so negative if you didn't perform well.
Mm.
Um, but I do think that also these days though, like heading into the next like 10 years, I think there's a lot of opportunity in entrepreneurship.
Oh, I do
And
too.
you don't necessarily need a college degree these days to be able to come up with really cool business ideas or business plans. It might be a little hard to get that initial funding.
Yeah.
The economy is really, really tough right now. So you need connections to get funds. Um, but being able to be creative with business plans and network with friends is pretty cool.
And that was,
Uh,
I found, once I got into college, I found out, there's so much you can do, in the real world, like because when I
there's opportunity.
started, when I went into college, I didn't know what I wanted, what kind of degree I wanted to get in. So I figured, I'll just get a business degree because that was a safe option. You can get a job, really about anything with it. And so I played
Yeah,
sports in high school, in between, as ways to stay fit for races. And so
yeah,
I played football, soccer, golf, and I got hurt playing football and my junior year, broke my wrist, and so it kind of put me on the back swing of racing, and I re-hurt it again my senior year. And so when I got out of college, or when I went into college, got out of high school into college, I had to have surgery on it, so I had to put a cadaver in and all. It was a
Mhm.
pretty intensive thing, and so right before it, my dad has an older brother that was ex-military, and so he lives in Colorado, and had a guy move in that was an orthopedic surgeon. And so he's been he was a retired colonel, and so then got out in the army and went and was high up with Raytheon for gosh, 10 years or longer, and then retired out of that.
It's really
Was just
cool.
bored, and so had that orthopedic surgeon move in next to him and just started doing insurance book work, stuff to keep busy. And, next thing I know, he was telling me he was, doing people's blood pressure and stuff, just kept going to school and, eventually made it to a first assistant. And so that was, the time I had to have surgery. So it was neat,
It was
and so that's what kind of, challenge, I thought, well, you know what, why not try and do something new? Obviously, coming from, you know, I always liked that challenge, like through racing and playing sports and stuff, that challenge. And
yeah.
so I think that's been the coolest
I think
process.
medical is the only industry outside of sports where you still get to be competitive with what you do.
I agree.
And the stakes are high.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's been the coolest part because going to those internships, it still feels like I'm competing at a race. It's like we talked about with your dad, he was able to take the data he learned from racing and,
and apply it
yeah.
into sex and trying to build a software platform.
Well,
Yeah,
and I
I'm
think,
purely on gamification and competitiveness.
and
It's something
I,
healthcare needs too. So
yeah, I think, more people, that are willing to, build something like that is going to be what changes the game. And I think
absolutely.
that's you know, change
Right.
is
And
inevitable in everything. And I think, when you can make a change in the right direction, you've kind of made a lasting impact into it.
100%. And you're right at the start of that wave too.
And
That's
so
cool.
yeah,
Big
it's really, you know, when I first,
perspectives.
did my intern, first started interning and, doctors, asked me like, what, kind of give you some, background stuff. And I told him I was a racer and, they first kind of look at you like you're crazy because, they're used, they think this high speed stuff. And so, but I told them, when you start breaking it down, I kind of thought about it as a race too, even before we did this, that, every surgery and every patient is like a lap. You can't run a perfect lap every race, but you
Yeah.
try to make it, as perfect as you can each time. And
And so
that's the cool part about, the comparison between the two. And I think that's really neat that we were able to, sit down and have this, talk. And I think that'd be
I really enjoyed it. So no, thank you.
no, absolutely. I've been, always I feel like, when I do these, it's kind of the same deal with with most drivers, I started in karts, made the transition to cars and, we talk about, some of the races you want, it's the same thing each time. And so I try to find,
Like
something new, you know,
some
you know,
fun.
yeah, something new. And I think this has been, the coolest thing because I've done it with some of these other, with some other drivers that are in IMSA that were didn't come from the racing background that they were, made their money doing something else and they just picked it up as a hobby. And, well, I think that's cool, but I think, this is something I think a lot of people can really grasp it, because I think there's this always, for most people, medical is something that they want to, everybody, thinks they want to, be a nurse or a doctor or something. But I think, when you compare something like racing to the
The
healthcare
medical,
profession,
right?
it's
It's an interesting perspective
it's
because
really,
not many people get to see that.
and
And honestly, what I'm so excited about with what we've done is not only does it bring that understanding that healthcare can be something to compete in, it helps the actual teams and it helps the doctors have benchmarks for themselves
right.
as opposed to just going through the motions.
And that's what,
So
that's the thing I don't like about, when I started my internship, it was at a small rural hospital. There
mm,
was nothing to compare anybody to, the doctor just came in. It was just a typical day, you
SEALs
have you got your, X number of cases and, most of it was the same. So, it was every time it wasn't really, they knew what to, pretty much knew what to do, coming in. Nothing, really changed. But when you move to somewhere, like a trauma hospital or something where, you're kind of thrown to the wolves with something unexpected is what, gives you that, feeling. And so that's what I liked so much about it. And so
absolutely.
it's, so cool how you can compare the two. Well, because, they seem like they're so different. but
both
when you
radically different, but it's
but when you start breaking it down, you can see the similarities. And I think that's what's been the coolest part of this. Well, you know, me and you and your dad have something, we both raced and we've
yeah,
both been within the medical. And so,
understand perspective.
we
So
understand this perspective of it that, the average person doesn't, the average person's never raced in their life, raced, at a level like me and you have. And,
yeah,
most that, the average people have never seen, the medical field like, we have. So I think this has been the coolest part to see the comparison between the two.
hmm very much so.
And,
So
the technology between the two is just, just growing. And I think that's what's the cool part about being, right in the thick of it.
very much so. And I hope the medical technology continues to improve. I think motorsports has far exceeded what it needed to do in terms of technology. We in healthcare have a lot to go.
I
So
like really, the thing I like to do is I like to really talk to these, the reps when they come in and, really quiz them on what these, new instruments and stuff can do, the capabilities of it. And,
right.
really, bridging that understanding from what you're going to do and putting it into the real world situation of the operating.
Mhm.
I think,
And I think that's where you're coming into healthcare with a fresh perspective. Um, you're coming in new, you have motorsports background, you get to see the lens of performance, data management, modern AI tech being implemented. Um, and you were talking about it. Most of the new innovation in healthcare is another implant or a new tool that bends 45 degrees instead of 47. And honestly, the money that's in healthcare and those subtle changes is exorbitant, and the actual impact to patient safety is very minimal. It's really just reps trying to sell at cost and at large. The tech that you're going to be able to usher into healthcare and that we're trying to do at the same time in terms of like AI is going to make such a huge impact and in terms of the actual effect of where healthcare goes. And I'm excited for it. It's going to be a really, really important next 10 years.
yeah,
Uh, Very important. And I don't really think anyone has an understanding of, I mean, we're at the point where we're at the forefront of innovating this push of AI into applied surgery. And we still have no idea where it's going to end up because the data that we're collecting has never existed.
yeah,
Like
it's
how is insurance going to react? How are the manufacturers of the medical devices going to use or actually take advantage of this information? So our medical school is going to start tailoring custom procedures specifically around doctors because now we know how everyone stacks up. Like we're not grown enough for a product like ours to have that much data gathered, but over time that kind of data is going to become available. We're going to see who the Max Verstappen of surgery is.
exactly. And, these
So
next, like
pretty
10
cool.
years, yeah, these next 10 years are, so important to it, to see
Mhm.
what can happen. And so, every day when I go back to my internship, at the end of the summer, I'm excited to see what, new innovations they're going to be able to bring because, you look at surgery now, they do a lot of it, this Da Vinci robot is still,
$1 million robot or something exorbitantly expensive.
yeah, it's cool to see what it can do, but, when you break it down though, I think there's, a lot better ways we can do it. The technology is here. And, eventually the Da Vinci is going to be old technology. It's going to be, a fossil.
Mhm.
And
Well, Elon's trying to replace all doctors with robots, so there's that perspective. I'm not an advocate.
no, I'm not, no, no, by no means advocate of that.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think he understands like the fact that you need a liability decision maker
Yeah.
in the and just automate it 100% with
It doesn't have to
robotics.
just be in the OR, just, your regular everyday checkup, a rope, I
I
would
mean,
much.
search guiding these Da Vinci robots. I mean, Da Vinci already could automate a procedure 100% if it
Oh
wanted.
yeah,
It has
it has the
they
capability.
automate it. So there's like a reason. So but yeah, with what we're doing with glasses, we're just trying to democratize healthcare.
They're
Make it so that anyone can
afford it.
so the right affordability, the
Yeah,
right capabilities and performances. Um, so it'll keep going.
yeah.
But yeah, you go get some dinner. I'm gonna go try and find some Chipotle somewhere down
Oh,
the
I know
road.
that's right. Kyle, I appreciate this opportunity to get and talk with you. I'm glad we got to make this happen, and I can't wait to see how many see what this does.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and feel free to shoot me a link over whenever you get the podcast up and running and I'd
Yeah,
love to start. No, thank you.
yeah,
And
and
I'll get a text with my iRacing.
yeah, absolutely, and I'll let you know. We'll be at Daytona Sebring. At the beginning of the year. I'd love have you out. Get to see some of this.
I'd love
I know
to.
you've seen
And
it.
are you around Performance Tech at all in the paddocks?
So they haven't been as quite as fluent in IMSA as they were when you were in it, but I don't, I would love to, get to meet some people within the team. I love building these connections with these, teams and,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
you
Well,
know,
if we're around and if they're at the paddock, I'd love to run by and introduce you and if
absolutely,
any a possible connect to
A-
getting some of the marketing at some of those events.
absolutely.
Do that for you. So
The thing I do about, with these podcasts and stuff and, shooting photos and stuff for people at track is, a lot of it is, going to the track, I have an idea in my mind of who I want to, talk to, but, a lot of it is, you just go and,
mhm.
hope you meet the right people. And the cool thing is, I've met enough people that, word of mouth kind of travels that, I'm able to, get to, share these stories and stuff with the people. And so that's what I like to do ultimately while I'm still trying to build, I do it for a friend of mine. We're trying to build something because we're both former racers. He was a carter too, but he had to, nothing, a different skill set than we did. He was a dirt guy. And while, living in, rural Georgia, you're kind of expected, if you race, to go dirt or NASCAR. That was never what my skill set was or what I really wanted. But as a racing fan, I still appreciate it. But it's cool to, to compare the perspectives that we have. And so ultimately
Yeah,
that's what I like to do. And, just getting to meet I like to meet them on a different level like this because you can find out more of what goes on into, to make a race happen. And so, you know, I think, like what we talked about with Daytona and Sebring, what really makes that race happen.
yeah, absolutely. And it always boils down to the team. So it's a team sport and people.
Absolutely. I have to ask, is that the Rolex from 17?
It is.
Oh,
Yeah. I fruitfully wear it happily, so
oh, I don't blame
it's
you.
it's probably my most prized possession, and I'm not one of those guys that wants to keep it in a box. So
No, I wouldn't, I would want to, wear that, as much as I could.
yeah, I try to.
I know some of those drivers that, they don't want to keep nothing,
So
they, I always like, showing off what I was able to accomplish at track, those trophies, keep them and all. But, and there's some people that just,
like like to wear it. So
yeah, and
uh,
that'd be something I think that's the coolest trophy you can get. I think, Sebring, Lamar, those are cool races to win. But, at the end of the day, Rolex you can't buy that
I,
Rolex.
even in most sports, like I wouldn't take a green jacket over.
The Rolex. Oh no, that's the one I would over any of it. I love golf, and I would, I would give the,
Take a Daytona 24 Rolex
yeah,
over
because
a Mac.
you can't. I talked to a Rolex dealer, they said that's the, Daytona's the hardest watch to get, for a seller. You have to, their store has to sell I don't remember exactly how many, but an X number amount of watches to be able to sell a Daytona. But, I wouldn't want to buy a Daytona. I would want to, win it on track because I think that's the coolest prize in sports.
It's the coolest prize, and once you have one, it's hard to ever want to go into a Rolex store and buy one.
Oh, I know.
That
I can't, I know plenty of, people that,
everyone,
have them.
everyone knows Rolex, but I'm just like. sure, I could go buy another. No, I got the one you can't
You
buy,
know,
so
yeah,
don't waste the color. Yeah, don't
that's the
waste a
creme
dollar.
de la creme of what, Rolexes there. I mean, I love
Yeah,
Rolex is my dream watch, and I love them, but
you
that
gotta go
Daytona
with.
24 is the one. I'm still young, I'm 22, and maybe
Oh, you have time. You have
yeah,
time.
that's my
Yeah,
goal is
you're
the
your whole life ahead of you to go win a
yeah,
Rolex.
I told that's why I tell people all the time that because they know me, I'm a big watch guy, and they said, well, what's the one like they know it's Rolex, but they know it's the one you can't buy. It's that one that you got right there, and so
Cool.
that's the
So,
that's the cool one there. But Kyle, I think this was really great, and I'd love to sit down and do some more talking. Even more of this. Bridging the gap from the medical field of what me and you have been able to experience, and I'd love to, I know I'm probably busy, but I'd love to get your dad on, to really get his,
I would love to present the opportunity to him. I'm sure he'd love to convey his perspectives because
you
his
know,
come from a different lens than mine.
yeah,
Uh, so I'll absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. I
So
think that'd be really cool. There's so much more we can talk about, from our experiences than just racing.
mhm,
I think that's, the
absolutely.
forefront of what I do is, bringing, racing to everyone. But I think, this was really cool to be able to compare racing to what me and you's 9 to 5 job is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think
And
that's what's really made this awesome.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And
Have
definitely
a
we'll
good
keep
night.
in touch.
Absolutely. Shoot me a text. Whenever you
Absolutely.
figure out the situation, let me know.
Absolutely. But I think this was a really cool thing, and I'm glad we got to make this happen.
Yeah. Let me send you an email real quick.
All right.